Picture a great river flowing through history, its currents shaped by the powerful forces we all know: the kings and emperors, the popes and sultans, whose names fill our textbooks. We've been taught to watch these giants, to see history as their story alone. But what if I told you that the most dramatic shifts in that river's course often came not from these titans, but from something much smaller? A single stone placed in just the right spot can redirect the whole flow of water. In the epic saga of the Crusades, that stone was often a minor kingdom, a forgotten county, a strategic lordship, or a culturally rich principality operating in the shadows of empires. For centuries, the story of the Crusades has been dominated by figures like Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, and Frederick Barbarossa, the so-called great powers of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. We picture vast armies and legendary battles as if history were only made on the grandest stages. But what if we've been missing the real story? What if the fate of Jerusalem, the success of entire campaigns, and the very direction of medieval history were actually decided by smaller, overlooked realms whose names barely register in popular memory? These were the places that supplied the armies, forged the alliances, gathered the intelligence, and sometimes even betrayed the cause in ways that changed everything. That's exactly what we're exploring today: 25 unsung turning points where minor kingdoms redirected Crusader history. This isn't just a list of footnotes, it's a journey into the hidden mechanics of power, a deep dive into the moments where the smallest actors tipped the scales. We'll travel from the mountains of Armenian Cilicia to the harbors of Cyprus, from the cultural melting pot of Edessa to the diplomatic courts of Antioch. Together, we'll uncover how these lesser-known realms used strategy, ingenuity, and sheer determination to shape events far beyond their size. So settle in, we're about to rediscover the Crusades not as a tale of giants, but as a mosaic of fascinating, overlooked players who truly made history happen. To truly grasp the Crusades, we must shift our gaze from the grand parades of European monarchs to the complex, often chaotic patchwork of smaller states that dotted the medieval Levant. This was a world not just of empires, but of micro-kingdoms, precarious principalities, and ambitious counties, each navigating a dangerous geopolitical landscape with a mix of shrewd calculation and sheer survival instinct. These were the overlooked actors, the supporting cast who often stole the show, operating in the long shadows cast by Byzantium, the Seljuk Turks, and the arriving Crusader armies from the west. Their story is one of immense geopolitical significance, yet for centuries they have been marginalized in our mainstream accounts, reduced to footnotes in a story told through the lens of great powers. Why have they been forgotten? Largely because history, then and now, tends to be written by and about the biggest players. Chroniclers accompanying Crusader armies naturally focused on their own kings and knights, their glorious charges and tragic defeats. The local rulers who provided the bread, the guides, and the safe passage were seen as part of the scenery, not the architects of strategy. This has created a distorted picture, one that ignores a fundamental truth of the era, a point stressed by historians like Thomas Bridge. The success or failure of the Grand Crusades often hinged not on the battlefield heroics of a famous king, but on the fragile, local alliances forged with these minor powers. A single decision by an Armenian prince or a Lebanese lord could determine whether an army starved in the mountains or found a route to victory. The diversity of these smaller states is key to understanding their collective impact. They were not a monolithic block, but a fascinating array of entities with different origins, cultures, and motivations. there was the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, a Christian bastion nestled in the Taurus Mountains that became a crucial ally and supply base. There was the County of Tripoli, a coastal power whose naval prowess would prove indispensable. There was the island kingdom of Cyprus, a later creation that evolved into a vital economic and military hub. And there were the Crusader states themselves, like the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa, which started as bold European conquests but quickly had to adapt, becoming hybrid states that often had more in common with their local neighbors than with distant Europe. Take the County of Edessa, our foundational case study. Founded by Baldwin of Boulogne, it was the first Crusader state established and the first to fall. Its story perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of these minor powers, profoundly vulnerable yet incredibly influential. Isolated deep in the Mesopotamian frontier, Edessa was surrounded by powerful Turkish emirates. Its survival depended not on strength alone, but on a delicate dance of diplomacy, cultural fusion, and alliances with its Armenian and Syriac Christian subjects. It was a linchpin, a buffer state whose existence protected the more powerful kingdom of Jerusalem to the south. When Edessa finally fell to Zengi in 1144, it wasn't just the loss of a remote county. It was a catastrophic shock that triggered the entire Second Crusade, proving how the fate of even the smallest Crusader entity could send ripples across continents. Their roles were multifaceted and absolutely critical to the broader effort. They were the suppliers, providing food, horses, and fresh troops to armies exhausted from long marches. They were the strategists, offering priceless local intelligence on enemy movements, terrain, and water sources that European commanders would have otherwise missed. And on occasion, they could be saboteurs. When their interests diverged, these minor kingdoms might shift allegiances, withhold support, or even engage in their own conflicts, inadvertently opening new fronts or diverting crucial resources. They operated in the shadows of empires, but as we are about to see, it was often from those shadows that they redirected the light of history itself. And so we arrive at our first unsung turning point, a moment where the fate of the entire First Crusade hinged not on a legendary knight, but on the shrewd decision of a lesser-known king and the strategic value of his mountainous domain. As the weary and battered Crusader armies stumbled out of the harsh landscapes of Asia Minor in the autumn of 1097, they were facing a crisis. They were dangerously low on supplies, plagued by sickness, and utterly lost in a foreign land, with the formidable goal of capturing Antioch still looming ahead. Their salvation came from an unexpected quarter, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, a Christian state tucked away in the Taurus Mountains under the leadership of its resourceful ruler, Constantine I. The strategic importance of Cilicia's location cannot be overstated. It acted as a vital land bridge, a crucial connective corridor between the Byzantine Empire to the west and the Crusader objectives in Syria and Palestine to the east. For the Crusaders, Cilicia was not just a place on a map, it was a lifeline. King Constantine recognized this geopolitical reality and seized the opportunity. He opened his kingdom's gates and his storehouses to the European forces. This was not a simple act of charity. It was a calculated move of supreme strategic importance. The Armenians provided the three things the Crusaders desperately needed: safe passage through treacherous mountain passes that were otherwise guarded by hostile Turkish forces, vast quantities of fresh food and supplies to replenish the starving army, and perhaps most critically, priceless military intelligence. Armenian scouts, with their intimate knowledge of the local terrain and the movements of the Seljuk Turks, became the eyes and ears of the Crusader commanders. This support was absolutely decisive in the early phase of the campaign. The contemporary chronicler Matthew of Edessa, an Armenian priest and historian, vividly documents this cooperation, portraying his countrymen not as passive observers but as active, unsung heroes whose intervention saved the crusade from potential disaster before it even reached its first major objective. He writes of the profound relief and gratitude felt by the Europeans, who saw the Armenians as Christian brethren in a sea of uncertainty. This was more than just a military alliance. It was a meeting of cultures that facilitated a crucial level of trust. Both groups were Eastern Christians, which created an immediate religious bond that smoothed over the vast differences in language and custom. There were exchanges of knowledge, Armenian guides teaching Crusaders about local water sources and foraging, while the Europeans shared news from the West. This cultural and religious affinity was the glue that made the military and logistical cooperation possible, turning a transactional arrangement into a genuine partnership. The alliance with Cilicia was a masterstroke that yielded immediate results. The intelligence provided by Armenian scouts allowed the Crusader vanguard to secure the strategic Cilician cities of Tarsus and Mamastra, protecting their flanks and securing their supply lines from Byzantine territory. Most importantly, it allowed them to arrive at the walls of Antioch not as a bedraggled, starving mob, but as a supplied and somewhat recovered fighting force, ready to undertake one of the most famous sieges in history. Without this Cilician intervention, the march to Antioch would have been far bloodier, and the army might have been too weakened to have any chance of success. This pivotal moment did more than just aid the initial success of the First Crusade. It set a powerful and enduring precedent. It demonstrated to every subsequent wave of Crusaders that survival and victory in the Levant depended on finding and cultivating alliances with the local Christian powers, a lesson that would be remembered and acted upon for the next 200 years. While the legendary exploits of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin dominate the popular memory of the Third Crusade, a quieter, far more crucial drama was unfolding just offshore of Acre. The two-year siege of that pivotal port city from 1189 to 1191 is often remembered as a brutal stalemate on land, a grueling war of attrition between two of history's most famous commanders. But the real key to breaking that stalemate wasn't found in the cavalry charges or the mining operations. It was found on the water, controlled not by a king or a sultan, but by the strategic genius of a minor power, the county of Tripoli under its shrewd ruler, Raymond III. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the clashing titans, Raymond and his modest fleet executed a masterstroke of naval warfare. They established and maintained a relentless naval blockade, a noose around the neck of the city that slowly but surely choked off its lifeline. Muslim ships carrying fresh troops, vital supplies, and reinforcements from Egypt and other allied territories found themselves unable to break through Tripoli's cordon. This single action fundamentally altered the calculus of the entire siege. It prolonged the conflict dramatically, stretching Saladin's resources, and most importantly, it bought the Crusaders the one thing they desperately needed: time. Time for their own reinforcements to arrive from Europe, and time for the fractured Crusader forces already on the ground to regroup, reorganize, and eventually launch a coordinated assault. The logistical prowess of Tripoli's fleet is a story that has been largely overshadowed by the romanticized tales of Richard's valor. These were not the grand warships of a major European navy. They were agile, locally built galleys, crewed by sailors who possessed an intimate, generational knowledge of the Levantine coast. This local expertise was their ultimate weapon. As historian Jonathan Riley Smith has emphasized, control of the sea lanes was often the difference between survival and collapse for the Crusader states. The sailors of Tripoli understood the capricious currents, the hidden reefs, and the seasonal wind patterns of the eastern Mediterranean in a way that no foreign captain ever could. There are accounts of Tripolitan captains using their knowledge of afternoon offshore breezes to swiftly reposition their vessels, cutting off escape routes that Muslim sailors believed were open. They knew exactly where to anchor to avoid being driven ashore in a sudden squall, allowing them to maintain their blockade through weather that would have forced a less experienced fleet to retreat. This turning point is a perfect demonstration of how a minor kingdom, by brilliantly leveraging its unique geographic advantages and specialized local knowledge, could exert an influence far disproportionate to its size on a major campaign. The county of Tripoli didn't have the vast armies of England or France, but it controlled a coastline and possessed a mastery of the sea that proved to be just as decisive. The fall of Acre, a pivotal victory for the Crusaders, was made possible not just by the knights on the walls, but by the sailors on the waves who ensured those knights had the opportunity to fight another day. Yet, even as the county of Tripoli was proving its mastery of the sea, the Crusader cause on land was being torn apart from within by bitter rivalries and clashing ambitions. The loss of Jerusalem had shattered not just morale but the very political cohesion of the Crusader leadership, creating a toxic atmosphere of distrust that threatened to undo any progress made at Acre. Into this volatile situation stepped an unexpected and often underestimated peacemaker, Guy of Lusignan, the embattled king of Jerusalem, who now found himself ruling the prosperous island kingdom of Cyprus. It was from this new power base that Guy would perform his most critical service to the Third Crusade, not as a warrior, but as a shrewd and desperately needed mediator. The political fragmentation after the fall of Jerusalem was profound and dangerous. The Crusader camp was split into fiercely opposed factions. On one side was Guy himself, desperately trying to assert his legitimacy as king despite the catastrophic loss of his capital. Arrayed against him was a powerful coalition led by Conrad of Montferrat, the charismatic and ambitious defender of Tyre, who argued that Guy's failure had rendered his kingship void and that a new, more capable leader was needed. This was not a simple disagreement, it was a schism that paralyzed strategic decision-making. Armies refused to cooperate, supplies were hoarded by rival lords, and councils of war devolved into shouting matches. The chronicler Roger of Howden vividly describes the scene, noting that the discord was so severe it was a greater threat to the Christian cause than Saladin's armies. The entire campaign was on the verge of collapsing from within before it could even truly begin. Cyprus, under Guy's control, became the essential neutral ground where these warring factions could be brought to the table. The island was perfectly positioned both geographically and politically. It was close enough to the action to be relevant, yet separate enough from the mainland's immediate pressures to serve as a place of respite and reason. Guy, perhaps because his own power was now based in Cyprus rather than the contested mainland, could act with a new degree of impartiality. He hosted negotiations, shuttled messages between the hostile parties, and used his Cypriot resources as a bargaining chip to incentivize cooperation. His envoys, skilled diplomats who understood both European and Levantine customs, worked tirelessly to find common ground. Roger of Howden specifically praised the tact and patience of these Cypriot intermediaries, whose efforts were instrumental in brokering a temporary but crucial compromise. The agreement was messy and far from perfect. Guy would remain king for his lifetime, but Conrad would inherit the crown upon his death, but it was enough. It stopped the infighting and allowed the combined Crusader forces to finally focus their collective might on the Siege of Acre. Beyond the diplomacy, Cyprus provided something even more tangible: unparalleled economic and military support as a forward base of operations. The island's fertile plains became the breadbasket for the Crusader army, its warehouses stockpiled with grain, wine, and salted meat shipped directly to the troops at Acre. Its harbors, particularly Famagusta, were transformed into bustling logistical hubs where ships from Europe could offload reinforcements and supplies in a secure environment, safe from Muslim naval raids. This steady flow of men and material from Cyprus was the lifeline that sustained the grueling two-year siege. Without this secure island base, the Crusader army would have withered on the vine, unable to sustain itself logistically long enough to achieve victory. This dual role, as both a diplomatic neutral zone and a logistical powerhouse, fundamentally altered the perception of Cyprus. It was no longer just a conquered territory. It had become an indispensable player in the Crusader world. Guy of Lusignan's mediation did more than just prevent the Third Crusade from immediate collapse. It elevated his kingdom from a mere possession to a pivotal center of power, a status it would maintain for centuries to come. The ability to forge unity from discord proved to be a weapon as powerful as any sword. While the diplomats of Cyprus were weaving fragile alliances, the warriors of the Principality of Antioch were mastering a different kind of survival skill on the rugged frontier of northern Syria. In the early 12th century, Antioch was a realm perpetually on a knife's edge, a Christian outpost surrounded by powerful Turkish emirates. Its survival depended not just on the strength of its famous Norman knights, but on something far more subtle and often completely invisible in the chronicles: superior intelligence. This crucial advantage was crystallized in the spring of 1105, when Prince Tancred of Antioch faced a massive Seljuk army led by the formidable Ridwan of Aleppo near the town of Artah. Confronted with a force that likely outnumbered his own, Tancred knew a straightforward charge would be suicide. His victory would hinge not on brute force, but on the priceless information provided by a network of local scouts, both Christian and Muslim, who knew the land intimately. The tactical advantage granted by this local expertise was absolute. While the Seljuk army moved through the landscape as a foreign occupier, Tancred's scouts provided him with a living, breathing map of the battlefield. They identified the hidden gullies that could conceal ambushes, the firm ground that would support a heavy cavalry charge, and the precise locations of Ridwan's troop concentrations and their vulnerable supply lines. This was not a minor detail. It was the difference between a chaotic melee and a calculated trap. Military historian John France has extensively argued that medieval warfare is too often caricatured as a simple clash of ignorant brutes, when in reality, the role of intelligence, of knowing where the enemy was, what he intended, and how the land could be used against him was just as critical then as it is today. At Artah, Tancred used this intelligence to perfection. He feigned a retreat, luring the overconfident Seljuk cavalry onto a patch of ground his scouts had identified as ideal for his counterattack. Once the Turkish horsemen were committed, his hidden knights emerged and smashed into their flanks, turning their advance into a confused and bloody rout. The Battle of Artah was a decisive victory that secured Antioch's eastern frontier for years, and it was won primarily through information. This practice of employing local scouts quickly became a standard, if unsung, element of military doctrine for the Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem regularly used Bedouin trackers to navigate the vast deserts of the south, while the county of Tripoli relied on Maronite Christians from the Lebanese mountains to watch for armies moving along the coast. These scouts were more than just guides. They were cultural and linguistic interpreters who could infiltrate enemy camps, gauge morale, and even spread disinformation. Their willingness to serve often stemmed from complex local politics, a rivalry between a Turkish emir and a Seljuk sultan, might make the former's subjects temporarily amenable to working with the Franks against a common foe. This system created a dynamic and fluid intelligence web that allowed the smaller Crusader armies to consistently punch above their weight, outmaneuvering larger forces through superior knowledge rather than superior numbers. The victory at Artah stands as a powerful testament to how the minor Crusader kingdoms, through pragmatism and adaptation, integrated local expertise to overcome immense disadvantages. They realized that to survive, they had to stop being purely European invaders and become something new Levantine powers who understood and leveraged the human and geographical landscape around them. This military innovation, born of necessity in places like Antioch, became a cornerstone of Crusader resilience for generations. But even the most brilliant battlefield tactics could not sustain a kingdom forever if its economy faltered. While knights and scouts secured the borders, it was often merchants and accountants who ensured there was enough money to pay for the armies in the first place. Yet for all their battlefield ingenuity, the Crusader states faced a challenge that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve alone: the simple, grinding reality of logistics. How do you sustain a European-style kingdom thousands of miles from home, in a land often hostile and resource-scarce? The answer did not come from the throne of Jerusalem, but from the bustling, profit-driven harbors of the Italian peninsula. While the Kingdom of Jerusalem is often portrayed as the premier Crusader power, its survival was paradoxically dependent on a group of what were, in the grand scheme of medieval geopolitics, minor actors: the maritime republics of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. These were not empires but agile city-states, merchant oligarchies whose power was measured not in vast tracts of land, but in fleets of swift galleys and ledgers filled with trade deals. Their support was not guaranteed by feudal obligation. It was purchased through a series of meticulously negotiated trade privileges that created one of the most fascinating and vital economic partnerships of the Middle Ages. The commercial underpinnings of Crusader survival, as economic historian David Abulafia has masterfully detailed, were every bit as important as their military triumphs. The Italian fleets were the indispensable lifeline connecting the Outremer, the land beyond the sea, to the resources of Europe. Without their ships, the steady flow of pilgrims, knights, weapons, iron, timber, and most crucially, food, would have slowed to a trickle, stranding the Crusader kingdoms in a state of perpetual siege. But these services came at a price. The Italians were pragmatic partners, not pious volunteers. In exchange for their naval muscle and transport capacity, they demanded exclusive commercial rights that would guarantee them immense wealth. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, perpetually short on cash and ships of its own, had little choice but to agree, signing treaties that effectively outsourced its maritime sovereignty. These agreements were far from uniform. They were complex, specific, and fiercely negotiated, each republic jockeying for advantage over the others. The rewards were extravagant. A typical treaty, like the one granted to the Genos after their pivotal role in the capture of Caesarea in 1101, would grant them entire streets and districts in the port cities, sovereign enclaves where their own laws applied, complete with churches, bakeries, and bathhouses. They received exemptions from all import and export taxes, allowing them to trade without any financial burden. Most lucratively, they were often given a direct one-third share of the plunder from any city their fleet helped capture, a clause that turned holy war into a lucrative investment opportunity. The Siege of Tyre in 1124 provides a perfect case study. The city was a formidable island fortress, seemingly impregnable to the land-based Crusader army. It was only the arrival of a Venetian fleet, summoned by the promise of extensive trade privileges, that made the victory possible. The Venetians established a naval blockade, prevented Egyptian reinforcements from arriving by sea, and provided the siege engines and engineers for the assault. In return, they were granted their own quarter in Tyre, freedom from taxes, and a percentage of the city's revenues, transforming them into permanent power brokers in the region. This economic maneuvering, orchestrated by these lesser-known mercantile powers, proved absolutely vital for the long-term sustainability of the Crusader project. The Italian quarters became thriving commercial hubs, ensuring that even in times of military setback, the ports remained open for business, pumping essential goods and money into the local economy. The constant rivalry between Genoa, Pisa, and Venice did sometimes spark violent clashes in the streets of Acre, but it also created a competitive system that guaranteed at least one fleet would usually be available for hire to the highest bidder. This intricate web of deals and privileges showcases a profound historical truth. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land was not just built on faith and steel, but on a foundation of contracts, commodities, and cold, hard cash, with ambitious Italian admirals acting as the often overlooked architects of its endurance. Isolated deep in the Fertile Crescent, far from the coastal strongholds of the other Crusader states, the county of Edessa faced an existential dilemma. It was a Frankish island in a vast Mesopotamian sea of Armenians, Syriacs, and Muslims. The traditional model of conquest imposing foreign rule by force was a guaranteed path to swift rebellion and collapse. Instead, under the leadership of its first count, Baldwin of Boulogne, later Baldwin I of Jerusalem, Edessa pioneered a radically different and astonishingly successful strategy: profound cultural fusion. This was not a superficial tolerance but a deep, pragmatic integration that wove the Frankish ruling class into the very fabric of local society, creating a resilient administration that, against all odds, endured for nearly half a century. This unsung policy of coexistence became its greatest armor, proving that in the realm of empire building, sometimes the soft power of shared customs could be a far stronger fortification than any stone wall. This integration was a masterclass in pragmatic governance, a point stressed by historian Christopher McEvitt in his work on the subject. He argues that the Crusader states, particularly frontier outposts like Edessa, operated with a remarkable degree of rough tolerance. This wasn't about enlightened multiculturalism in the modern sense. It was a hard-nosed, practical necessity for survival. The Frankish knights, vastly outnumbered, could not hope to govern through force alone. They needed the loyalty of the local population to collect taxes, administer justice, and most critically, to defend the territory. The counts of Edessa understood that their security depended on the eyes and ears of the local Armenians and Syriacs, who could provide invaluable intelligence about the movements of Turkish armies from Mosul or Aleppo. A trusted local farmer reporting a dust cloud on the horizon was an early warning system more effective than a dozen watchtowers. Similarly, their supply networks were entirely reliant on the existing trade routes and agricultural knowledge of the very people they now ruled. To alienate them was to starve, to integrate with them was to thrive. This policy of fusion manifested in remarkably tangible ways, with intermarriage standing as the most powerful symbol of the new reality. Frankish knights and soldiers, often cut off from any hope of returning to Europe or finding a Latin bride, frequently married women from the local Armenian and Syriac aristocracy. These unions were more than just personal relationships. They were strategic alliances that bound the fate of the Frankish nobility to that of the local elite. A knight who married an Armenian lord's daughter suddenly had a vested interest in the security and prosperity of the entire community, not just his own feudal holding. His children would be bilingual, fluent in both Old French and Armenian, and would navigate both cultural worlds with ease. This created a new hybrid ruling class, one that could command respect in a Frankish hall and an Armenian church alike. Beyond the nobility, this cultural blending seeped into daily life. Frankish settlers adopted local dress for the scorching summer heat, began to enjoy Levantine cuisine, and incorporated Eastern musical instruments into their festivities. In turn, elements of European law and feudal custom were gradually absorbed into the local legal frameworks. The result of this deliberate cultural strategy was a period of unexpected stability that allowed the county of Edessa to punch far above its weight for decades. It became a resilient buffer state, absorbing the first blows from Eastern invaders and providing the Kingdom of Jerusalem precious time to prepare its defenses. The trust built through these daily acts of coexistence meant that when a Turkish army approached, the county could raise a more united front. Local militias, fighting for their own homes and their Frankish neighbors-in-laws, would stand alongside the European knights. This deeply ingrained stability not only prolonged Edessa's own existence but served as a powerful, influential model for other Crusader states. Leaders in Antioch and Tripoli took note, realizing that their own longevity might depend less on building taller walls and more on building stronger bonds with the diverse peoples who called the Levant home. It was a lesson in survival written not in stone but in the shared lives of its people, and as this cultural experiment unfolded on the frontier, another minor kingdom was discovering that survival sometimes required a different kind of compromise, one not of culture but of faith itself. For the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, nestled in the rugged mountains of southern Anatolia, survival was a constant high-wire act. Surrounded by powerful Muslim rivals like the Seljuks and later the Mamluks, this Christian kingdom, though a valued ally to the Crusaders, was perilously isolated. Its rulers understood that their military strength would never match that of their adversaries. Their most potent weapon, it turned out, was not found in their armories but in their chapels. Under the ambitious and pragmatic king Leo I, known as Leo the Magnificent, Cilicia embarked on a daring and unprecedented strategy, using theology as a tool of statecraft, negotiating a formal religious union with the Catholic Church in the hopes of securing the one thing they desperately needed, a guaranteed stream of military support from the West. The theological negotiations that led to the Union of Cis in 1198 were a masterpiece of diplomatic and ecclesiastical maneuvering. The differences between the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Church of Rome were profound and centuries old, touching on the very nature of Christ, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and the precise authority of the Pope. To bridge this gap, King Leo invited Latin theologians and diplomats to his court, hosting intricate debates and discussions. The resulting agreement was a carefully worded compromise. The Armenian Church, in principle, acknowledged the supreme authority of the Pope and accepted certain Latin doctrines, most notably the nature of Christ as defined by the Council of Chalcedon. In return, the Church made significant concessions to Armenian rites and customs, allowing them to maintain their unique liturgical practices and organizational structure. As one ecclesiastical historian noted, these were political compromises dressed in theological vestments. The primary goal was never a pure theological meeting of minds, but a public demonstration of alignment that would make Cilicia appear less as a foreign, schismatic Eastern church and more as a loyal outpost of Christendom, worthy of military investment. The immediate effects of this union were exactly what Leo had hoped for. The religious diplomacy provided Cilicia with a surge of legitimacy on the international stage. Pope Innocent III, a powerful advocate for the crusading movement, now formally recognized Leo not just as a king, but as a devoted son of the Church. This papal endorsement was a green light to the nobility of Europe. It triggered an influx of Western knights, mercenaries, and financial aid, all eager to serve a monarch now seen as fighting for the one true faith. This reinforcement significantly altered the balance of power in the region, allowing Cilicia to punch far above its weight for decades. The kingdom became a more reliable and potent ally for the other Crusader states, its strengthened armies providing a crucial northern buffer against forces moving out of Syria and Egypt. The alliance was no longer just a matter of shared geopolitical interest. It was now framed as a sacred duty, binding the fate of this minor Armenian kingdom much more tightly to the fortunes of the Latin West. This turning point stands as a brilliant, if cynical, example of how a vulnerable minor kingdom could leverage faith as the ultimate tool for survival. King Leo I understood that in the medieval world, religious identity was a currency that could be spent to raise armies and buy protection. The union of Cis was a calculated risk, a strategic decision to trade a degree of theological independence for the tangible, earthly power needed to preserve his kingdom's existence. It was a stark reminder that in the struggle for survival, even the most sacred of doctrines could be put on the negotiating table. And while Cilicia used doctrine to build an alliance, another small but fearsome power would soon demonstrate how a sudden shift in loyalty could tear the entire diplomatic landscape apart. In the shadowy world of medieval Middle Eastern politics, few groups cast a longer or more terrifying shadow than the Order of Assassins. This was not a kingdom in any traditional sense. They held no vast territories, fielded no great armies, but as a minor, non-state actor, their power was utterly unique and disproportionately potent. Operating from a network of remote, impregnable mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria, most famously Alamat and Masyaf, the assassins or Nizari Ismailis, were masters of psychological warfare. Their weapon of choice was not the siege engine or the cavalry charge, but the discreet dagger, wielded by a fanatically devoted operative who often sacrificed his own life to eliminate a single, carefully chosen target. For a time, this fearsome capability aligned with the interests of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, creating one of the most unconventional and intriguing alliances of the entire era. The foundation of this alliance was not friendship, but a cold, shared geopolitical interest. Both the Crusader kingdom and the assassin sect found themselves threatened by the rising power of the Sunni Muslim world, particularly the ambitious Zengid dynasty and later the forces of Saladin. The assassins viewed these Sunni rulers as existential threats to their own heterodox Shia beliefs and their political autonomy. The Crusaders, of course, were perpetually at war with them. This common enemy made for a strange partnership. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, as historian Bernard Lewis has detailed, saw the value in having a deadly, deniable proxy that could strike fear into the hearts of their most powerful adversaries. There are accounts of the assassins paying an annual tribute to the Templars, a kind of protection fee to ensure their own safety from Crusader attacks, which also functionally acted as a retainer for their services. It was a relationship built on mutual convenience and a healthy dose of fear. This calculated partnership yielded significant, if sinister, benefits for the Crusaders. The mere presence of the assassins forced Sunni leaders to divert immense resources to their own personal security, living in constant paranoia. More concretely, the assassins' blades removed key figures from the chessboard at critical moments. While the most famous stories of their exploits are often shrouded in myth, credible historical accounts point to assassinations that altered the political landscape. The murder of al-Afdal Shahanshah, the powerful vizier of Fatimid Egypt, in 1121, is one such example. His death threw the already fragile Egyptian regime into further disarray, creating a power vacuum that the Crusaders were able to exploit for years, delaying the unification of Egypt and Syria under a single, powerful Muslim ruler. Each successful strike by the assassins was a strategic windfall for Jerusalem, weakening their enemies without requiring them to commit a single soldier to battle. The betrayal, when it came, was not born of sudden malice but of ruthless realpolitik. As the balance of power in the region shifted dramatically with the rise of Saladin, the assassins were forced to recalculate their survival strategy. Saladin represented a far more immediate and overwhelming threat to their existence than the distant Crusader kings. Twice he besieged their strongholds, demonstrating a terrifying resolve to eliminate them. Facing annihilation, the Order's leader, the mysterious Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, made a pragmatic decision. He opened secret negotiations with Saladin. The details of their arrangement are still debated, but the outcome was clear. The assassins would cease their operations against Saladin and his allies. In a stunning demonstration of their new allegiance, they even attempted, though ultimately failed, to assassinate the greatest Crusader hero of the age, Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, in 1192. This was not merely a shift in alliance, it was a complete inversion of the previous order. The impact on Crusader security was immediate and profound. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its most potent covert weapon. Worse, that weapon was now potentially pointed in their direction. The constant, low-grade threat of assassination, which had for so long preoccupied Muslim leaders, was now a worry for the Frankish nobility. They were forced to divert precious resources, both manpower and mental energy, toward enhanced personal security, always watching for the shadow of the lone killer. The psychological blow was perhaps even greater than the material one. The betrayal demonstrated that in the complex and fluid politics of the Levant, there were no permanent allies, only permanent interests. A small, stateless sect, through a combination of sheer terror and brilliant geopolitical maneuvering, had successfully redirected the course of Crusader history, forcing a major power to react to its decisions. They proved that influence was not always measured in acres of land or thousands of troops, but sometimes in the cold, sharp point of a dagger and the chilling fear it could instill in the heart of a sultan or a king. While the shadowy dealings of the assassins altered the political landscape through fear, the success of any crusade ultimately depended on something far more mundane yet absolutely critical: the steady, uninterrupted flow of supplies. A grand army, no matter how brave or well led, is utterly useless if it cannot be fed, equipped, and reinforced. This simple, brutal truth of logistics was never more apparent than during the Fifth Crusade, which aimed its might at the heart of Ayyubid power in Egypt. As tens of thousands of Crusaders poured into the Levant, all destined for the Nile Delta, the entire operation hinged on the efficiency of a single, often overlooked port, the Lordship of Sidon. Under the masterful administration of its lord, Balian of Sidon, this minor coastal holding transformed its harbor into the most crucial logistical hub of the entire campaign, a feat of organizational genius that quite literally kept the crusade from collapsing. The challenge facing the crusade was immense. The target was Damietta, a heavily fortified port city guarding the Nile. To sustain a siege there, everything, every sword, every sack of grain, every bandage, every knight, had to arrive by sea from Europe, be unloaded at a friendly port on the Levantine coast, and then be transshipped south to Egypt. Any delay, any bottleneck at this transfer point would have catastrophic consequences for the army gathering outside Damietta. Sidon, with its naturally deep harbor and strategic location between the larger ports of Acre and Tyre, was perfectly positioned to take on this role. But a good location is not enough. It required a leader of exceptional administrative skill to make it work. That leader was Balian of Sidon, a member of the famed Ibelin family, who proved to be less a warrior and more a brilliant quartermaster and diplomat. Balian's genius lay in his understanding of coordination and anticipation. He didn't just open the port, he orchestrated it like a conductor leading a complex symphony. His most critical partnership was with the Italian maritime republics, the Genoese, Pisans, and Venetians whose fleets carried the lifeline of the Crusade. These merchant captains were notoriously independent and competitive, their rivalries often spilling over into violence that could paralyze a port. Balian managed this volatile situation with a mix of firm authority and shrewd incentive. He established a clear order of operations, allocating specific docking times and warehouse spaces to each group to prevent clashes. He negotiated favorable tariffs and offered safe harbor for their non-military trade goods, ensuring their commercial interests were met so they would prioritize the Crusader supply runs. This was not a simple task. It required a deep understanding of Mediterranean commerce and a diplomatic touch to balance the inflated egos of rival Italian admirals. As one maritime historian notes, the success of a crusade was often determined not on the walls of a besieged city, but on the crowded quaysides of its supply ports. The lord who could manage the chaos of men, ships, and cargo held the real key to victory. The proof of Sidon's success under Balian's management is found in specific, life-saving instances. Contemporary chronicles of the Fifth Crusade, such as the account by Oliver of Paderborn, describe moments when the army in Egypt was on the brink of starvation due to unexpected delays in supply ships from Europe. Each time it was Sidon that alleviated the crisis. Balian had instituted a policy of maintaining a strategic reserve of grain and salted meat in Sidon's warehouses, a buffer against just such an emergency. When word reached him of shortages at the Damietta siege camp, he would personally oversee the rapid loading of his reserve supplies onto the fastest available ships, cutting through the usual bureaucratic red tape. On at least 2 documented occasions, these emergency shipments from Sidon arrived just in time to prevent widespread famine and desertion among the common soldiers, buys the army the precious days it needed for the expected supply convoys to finally arrive from the west. This logistical prowess showcases in the clearest terms how a minor lordship, through administrative excellence rather than martial power, could make or break a large-scale military operation commanded by emperors and papal legates. The Fifth Crusade was a massive undertaking involving some of the most powerful figures in Europe, yet its momentum was sustained by the unsung efforts of a single lord and his efficiently run port. Sidon's harbor became the vital artery pumping blood to the body of the crusade in Egypt, and Balian of Sidon was its steady, indispensable heart. This behind-the-scenes mastery of logistics, however, stood in stark contrast to the very public, violent test of endurance that was about to unfold at a remote castle, where another group of unsung heroes would demonstrate that the best defense could sometimes be an unbreakable will. Perched high on a ridge overlooking the Mediterranean, the castle of Margat was more than just a fortress. It was a statement of sheer defiance. While the great cities of the Crusader coast like Acre and Tripoli captured the headlines, it was this formidable stronghold, entrusted to the Knights Hospitaller, that became the ultimate bulwark against the rising tide of Mamluk power. For decades, this minor lordship, often just a footnote in broader histories, served as the rock upon which wave after wave of Muslim attacks broke, providing the one thing the crumbling Crusader states needed most: precious, irreplaceable time. The Hospitallers, a military order originally founded to care for the sick, had transformed into some of the most tenacious and innovative defenders the Latin East had ever known, and their mastery of defense at Margat stands as a brilliant case study in how to make a fortress truly unconquerable. The strategic value of Margat's location was immediately apparent to any military commander. It sat like a sentinel on a high promontory south of Antioch, dominating the vital coastal road that connected the Mamluk heartlands in Egypt to their power centers in Syria. Any army wishing to move north or south along this corridor had to pass under the watchful gaze of Margat's garrison. This allowed the Hospitallers to effectively control the flow of men and supplies, intercepting reinforcements and raiding supply caravans with impunity. As the renowned military historian Hugh Kennedy has emphasized, the true power of a Crusader castle was not just in its ability to withstand a siege, but in its capacity to project power over the surrounding countryside, functioning as an offensive weapon in its own right. Margat was the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. It was a choke point, a cork in the bottle of the Levantine coast, and its very presence forced the Mamluks to commit vast resources and time to any campaign in the region, knowing they could not leave such a potent threat in their rear. To overcome such a strategic nuisance, the Mamluks needed to take the castle, and they tried repeatedly. Their failure was a testament to Margat's revolutionary design. The Hospitallers were not just warriors, they were master military architects who had learned from a century of warfare in the East. They expanded and enhanced the existing fortress into a concentric castle, a layered defense system that was generations ahead of its time. The outer walls were lower, designed to absorb and disrupt the initial assault, while the taller, thicker inner walls loomed behind them, creating a deadly killing zone between the two. Attackers who breached the first gate would find themselves trapped in this narrow courtyard, exposed to a horrific crossfire of arrows, stones, and boiling liquid poured from the inner battlements. The castle's immense storerooms were carved deep into the bedrock itself, capable of holding years' worth of food and water, making a simple starvation siege a futile endeavor. Its chapel even featured a rare defensive feature, a fortified tower, ensuring that even a place of worship could become a last redoubt. But stone and mortar were only part of the story. The Hospitallers' true genius lay in their application of relentless, aggressive guerrilla tactics. They refused to be passive defenders waiting behind their walls. The castle served as a base for constant, daring raids. Small, highly mobile groups of knights and Turcopole's local light cavalry employed by the Crusaders would sally forth under cover of darkness or through cleverly hidden postern gates to harass the besiegers. They would burn siege engines before they could be assembled, slaughter pack animals, and pick off stragglers and foragers. These actions were not aimed at winning a decisive battle. Their goal was attrition. They sought to drain the enemy's morale, deplete their supplies, and make the cost of maintaining a siege so exorbitantly high that the Mamluk commanders would eventually be forced to give up and withdraw. One chronicler tells of a particularly devastating raid where Hospitaller knights, disguised with captured Mamluk banners, managed to infiltrate an enemy camp and set the entire siege train ablaze, creating a confusion that allowed them to slip back into Margat unscathed. The cumulative impact of this decades-long defense cannot be overstated. Every year that the Mamluks were forced to pour men and treasure into the bottomless pit of a Margat siege was a year that the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Principality of Antioch had to reinforce their own defenses, train new troops, or appeal for aid from the West. The Hospitallers' stubborn resistance at this remote outpost bought the entire Crusader project breathing room, delaying the final, inevitable advance of Mamluk power down the coast. Furthermore, their success became a blueprint for resilience. The strategies of defense perfected at Margat, the concentric walls, the aggressive sallies, the emphasis on deep stores, were studied and emulated in other castles across Outremer, from the vast Crac des Chevaliers to the coastal stronghold of Atlet. They proved that even in an era of decline, a determined garrison, supported by brilliant engineering and unshakable resolve, could defy the odds and alter the timeline of history. This epic standoff, however, was ultimately a military solution to a political problem. While the Hospitallers held the line with steel and stone, another power was discovering that the most durable alliances could sometimes be forged not on the battlefield, but at the altar. While the Knights Hospitaller were proving that a castle could be a weapon of strategic delay, the Principality of Antioch was navigating a far more delicate kind of defense, one played out not on battlements, but in the royal courts and marriage chambers of the powerful. By the middle of the 12th century, Antioch was in a perilous position. It had lost its charismatic leader, Prince Raymond, in a disastrous battle, and now found itself ruled by a regent for the young Princess Constance. Surrounded by the rising power of Nur ad-Din in Aleppo, the principality was vulnerable, isolated, and desperately in need of a powerful protector. Its salvation would arrive not through a miracle on the battlefield, but through a brilliantly orchestrated marital arrangement, one that wove the fate of this minor Crusader state directly into the fabric of the vast Byzantine Empire. The marriage of Princess Constance of Antioch to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos in 1159 was a masterstroke of cross-cultural diplomacy, a personal union that created a temporary but formidable alliance and fundamentally redirected the political landscape of the entire northern Crusader frontier. The political maneuvering behind this union was intricate and revealed the complex realities of power in the Levant. For the Byzantines, this was a chance to reassert ancient claims. The Emperor Manuel Komnenos was a dynamic ruler intent on restoring the glory of the Roman Empire, and he viewed Antioch not as an independent Crusader state, but as a lost imperial province that had once belonged to Constantinople. Marrying its princess was the most elegant way to re-establish Byzantine suzerainty without the messy business of a full-scale invasion. For the Franks of Antioch, the calculation was one of pure, pragmatic survival. As the renowned chronicler William of Tyre, who was a masterful diplomat himself, observed, this was a moment where the necessity of the times compelled them to seek the favor of the emperor. They understood that their small, knightly army was no match for Nur ad-Din's disciplined forces. An alliance with Byzantium, the greatest Christian power in the region, offered the one thing they lacked: security. It was a bargain, trading a degree of political independence for the immense military shield of the Byzantine army. The immediate effect of this marriage was a powerful deterrent that echoed across the region. Nur ad-Din, the ambitious Turkish ruler of Aleppo who had made the destruction of the Crusader states his life's work, was suddenly faced with a completely new strategic reality. Attacking Antioch no longer meant fighting a few hundred Frankish knights. It now risked provoking a direct war with the entire Byzantine Empire, with its seemingly limitless reserves of gold and soldiers. This fear of triggering a massive Byzantine intervention effectively paralyzed Nur ad-Din's ambitions in northern Syria for several crucial years. The mere existence of the alliance acted as an invisible shield, allowing Antioch a period of precious stability to rebuild its treasury, repair its fortifications, and train new troops without the constant threat of imminent attack. This diplomatic shield was soon backed by the very tangible force of joint military campaigns. The most significant of these was a combined Frankish-Byzantine operation launched in the wake of the marriage. Emperor Manuel Komnenos personally led a magnificent imperial army into Cilicia, a region also claimed by Byzantium, where he joined forces with the Knights of Antioch. The sight of this combined force, flying both the cross of the Crusaders and the double-headed eagle of Byzantium, was a potent symbol of Christian unity and a stark warning to any potential aggressors. Together, they marched into the contested territory, not to engage in a major battle, but to project overwhelming power. Their presence forced local Armenian lords to reaffirm their allegiance to Constantinople and compelled Nur ad-Din to pull his forces back from the frontier, choosing to avoid a direct confrontation. William of Tyre, though often wary of Byzantine influence, could not help but acknowledge the success of this show of force, noting that it brought great terror to the hearts of the enemy and secured the borders for a time. The marriage of Constance and Manuel demonstrates with brilliant clarity how personal unions between a minor and a major power could serve as a strategic lifeline, redirecting historical trajectories through diplomacy rather than war. For Antioch, it was a calculated and necessary compromise that bought decades of added life, intertwining its destiny with an empire that could guarantee its survival. It was a reminder that in the high-stakes game of medieval geopolitics, a royal wedding could be as decisive as a victorious army, and that the path to security sometimes lay in willingly accepting the protection of a much larger neighbor. This delicate dance of diplomacy secured the northern flank, but it could not control the forces of nature or the basic human need for bread. As political alliances provided one kind of security, a looming environmental catastrophe was about to create a very different kind of opportunity, one that would be seized by a shrewd island kingdom. While the marriage alliance of Antioch showcased the power of high diplomacy, the survival of the entire Crusader endeavor often hinged on a far more basic necessity: the simple, profound need for bread. In an era of unpredictable rainfall and frequent siege warfare, famine was a constant, looming specter that could dissolve armies and depopulate cities faster than any enemy army. It was in these moments of desperate scarcity that the strategic value of a kingdom was truly measured, not by the number of its knights, but by the fullness of its granaries. No realm understood or exploited this reality better than the Kingdom of Cyprus under the visionary agricultural policies of its king, Hugh I. He transformed his island domain from a mere strategic outpost into the indispensable breadbasket of the Levant, wielding control over grain supplies as a tool of immense political and economic power that fundamentally reshaped its relationship with every other power in the region. King Hugh's foresight was nothing short of revolutionary for his time. He recognized that Cyprus's true strength lay not in its fortifications or its knights, but in its fertile soil and favorable climate. While the mainland Crusader states were often arid and perpetually under threat, Cyprus enjoyed reliable rains and vast cultivable plains. Hugh implemented a series of deliberate agricultural policies designed to maximize this natural advantage. He offered tax incentives and land grants to encourage the clearing of new fields and the planting of wheat and barley. He invested in the island's infrastructure, repairing and expanding irrigation systems that had lain fallow since Byzantine times to ensure consistent harvests even in drier years. Most importantly, he established a system of royal granaries, centralized storage facilities where surplus grain could be purchased and stockpiled by the crown during times of plenty. This was not merely a welfare program, it was the creation of a strategic reserve, a vast hoard of food that could be deployed with precision to influence events far beyond the island's shores. This calculated preparation turned Cyprus into an economic lifeline during the frequent famines that crippled the mainland. There are documented instances, particularly in the early 13th century, when failed harvests and constant warfare around Acre and Tripoli created catastrophic food shortages. Prices for a single bushel of wheat would skyrocket to levels unaffordable for all but the richest nobles, leading to widespread starvation among the poor and the rank-and-file soldiers who manned the walls. It was at these precise moments that Cypriot merchants, operating with the full backing of the royal court, would sail into these beleaguered ports. Their ships, laden with affordable grain from King Hugh's reserves, were a sight more welcome than any relieving army. They single-handedly stabilized markets, alleviated suffering, and quite literally kept the population, and thus the defensive capability of key Crusader cities intact. This control over the most fundamental resource of the medieval world granted Cyprus a form of influence that was both subtle and irresistible. As economic historians have noted, food security is the ultimate tool of power. It creates dependencies that are far more binding than any temporary military alliance. The Kingdom of Cyprus, through its grain trade, made the larger, more prestigious Crusader states its clients. This dynamic allowed King Hugh and his successors to negotiate from a position of surprising strength. When seeking military aid or political support, they could dangle the promise of preferential grain prices or prioritized shipments. Conversely, they could threaten to embargo a troublesome rival, a move that could provoke internal unrest and cripple their ability to wage war. This economic leverage allowed a relatively minor kingdom to punch far above its weight in diplomatic circles, extracting favorable trade treaties, securing military backing for its own projects, and ensuring that its voice was heard in the councils of the powerful. Cyprus was no longer just an ally, it was an indispensable partner, and its throne room had become one of the most important rooms in the entire Levant. Far from the sun-baked battlefields of the Holy Land, a different kind of crusade was unfolding in the dark, forested heart of Europe. In the early 13th century, the eastern frontier of the Kingdom of Hungary was a wild and vulnerable place, constantly threatened by incursions of nomadic Cumans from the steppes. Seeking a solution, King Andrew II of Hungary made a fateful decision. He would invite a dedicated military order, the Teutonic Knights, to settle in the remote eastern region of Transylvania. His offer was a generous one: autonomy over the land they could conquer and defend, a virtual state within a state. For the Knights, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to expand their crusading mission and build a powerful base of operations. They accepted eagerly, establishing a foothold that would, through a dramatic twist of fate, not only fail to secure Hungary's border, but would ultimately redirect the entire future of their order away from the Mediterranean and toward an entirely new theater of war, with profound consequences for the Crusader cause they were originally founded to serve. The political fallout from this arrangement was swift and severe. The Teutonic Knights, true to their ambitious nature, did not see themselves as mere border guards answerable to the Hungarian crown. Instead, they began acting as an independent sovereign power within Andrew's kingdom. They started building stone castles without his permission, encouraged settlers from Germany to populate their new territories, and even opened direct negotiations with the papacy, seeking to have their Transylvanian lands placed under the sole authority of the Pope, effectively removing them from Hungarian control altogether. For King Andrew, this was not a partnership, it was an act of rebellion and a blatant challenge to his royal authority. He could not allow a powerful, quasi-independent military state to grow within his own borders. In 1225, just over a decade after inviting them in, the king took decisive action. He assembled his army and forcibly expelled the Teutonic Knights from Hungary, tearing down their fledgling castles and reclaiming the land he had granted them. It was a humiliating eviction for the order, leaving them suddenly homeless and their grand ambitions in tatters. This expulsion, however, proved to be one of history's most consequential rejections. Cast out of Hungary, the Knights were desperate for a new purpose and a new territory where they could fulfill their crusading vows. their gaze turned north to the shores of the Baltic Sea. Almost simultaneously, another opportunity presented itself, an invitation from Conrad of Masovia, a Polish duke, to help subdue and convert the fierce pagan Baltic tribes known as the Old Prussians. This time, the knights were wiser. They negotiated their terms with meticulous care, securing absolute sovereignty over any territory they could conquer. With this guarantee in hand, they launched what would become the Prussian Crusade, a decades-long campaign of conquest and colonization that would ultimately see them forge their own independent state, the monolithic order state of Prussia. As historian Erik Christiansen notes in his work on the Northern Crusades, this pattern of expulsion and migration was not uncommon for military orders. Their international character and relentless ambition often made them guests who overstayed their welcome, forcing them to constantly seek new frontiers. The Teutonic Knights, propelled by their failure in Transylvania, simply found their ultimate frontier on the icy shores of the Baltic. This dramatic shift in focus had a direct and detrimental impact on the flow of Crusader resources to the Holy Land. The Teutonic Knights were one of the three great military orders, alongside the Templars and Hospitallers, and their wealth, manpower, and military expertise were now almost entirely diverted to their new northern project. The endless war in Prussia became a magnet for crusading energy that might otherwise have gone to reinforce the beleaguered states of Outremer. German nobles who once might have traveled to Acre to earn salvation now found a much closer and often more lucrative crusade on their doorstep. The order's vast fundraising networks across Germany, which had previously channeled money and recruits to the Levant, were repurposed to support their Prussian adventures. The Holy Land was effectively competing with Prussia for the same pool of European fervor and finance, and it was losing. The Teutonic Knights, originally founded in a hospital outside Acre during the Third Crusade, had become a world away, both geographically and strategically, from their birthplace, their immense power now dedicated to building an entirely new Crusader empire in the north. This 13th turning point is a powerful illustration of how the actions of a minor realm, in this case the Kingdom of Hungary, could indirectly and unintentionally alter the broader course of Crusader history through a simple act of expulsion. King Andrew II's decision to rid his kingdom of a troublesome guest didn't just solve a local political problem. It set in motion a chain of events that redirected one of the most powerful military institutions of the Middle Ages toward a new destiny. The Knights' expulsion from Transylvania was the catalyst that launched them on their path to becoming the masters of the Baltic, a move that siphoned vital men, money, and momentum away from the original Crusader cause in the East. It is a stark reminder that in the interconnected world of medieval politics, a decision made in a remote Hungarian castle could echo all the way to the walls of Jerusalem, weakening its defenses not through malice, but through the unpredictable consequences of redirected ambition. While the Teutonic Knights were forging a new destiny in the north, the success of any crusading effort still ultimately depended on the ability to cross the sea, a journey that was as perilous as any battlefield. The vast, unpredictable Mediterranean was the great highway of the Crusades, and the design of the ships that traversed it could mean the difference between an army arriving fresh and ready for combat or scattered, seasick, and decimated by storms. During the pivotal and chaotic Fourth Crusade, a minor maritime republic, often overshadowed by its giant Italian rivals, emerged as a quiet innovator whose technological contributions would prove indispensable. The Republic of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik, was a compact city-state on the Adriatic coast, but within its renowned shipyards, craftsmen were perfecting the design of the medieval galley, creating vessels that offered the Crusaders a faster, more reliable, and more survivable means of transport. The Ragusan galley was a masterpiece of pragmatic naval engineering, evolved through generations of sailing the challenging waters of the eastern Adriatic. While the great ships of Venice and Genoa were designed for carrying vast quantities of cargo or for fighting massive set-piece naval battles, the Ragusans specialized in something arguably more valuable for the Crusader cause: efficiency and agility. Their galleys were slightly longer and narrower than the standard design, a hull shape that reduced water resistance and allowed them to achieve greater speeds under both oar and sail. This was not a trivial advantage. A faster ship could outrun pirates and hostile fleets, but more importantly, it could drastically reduce the transit time for troops and supplies. Every day shaved off a journey meant less consumed food and water, lower risk of disease outbreak among the packed ranks of soldiers and horses, and a greater chance of arriving during a narrow seasonal window favorable for campaigning. This focus on reliability was their second great innovation. Ragusan shipbuilders placed a heavy emphasis on the quality of their materials and construction techniques. They sourced their oak from specific, managed forests in the Balkan hinterlands, wood that was known for its density and resistance to rot. Their caulking methods, using a particular blend of pitch and hemp, were renowned for creating a much tighter seal, making their ships notably drier and less prone to leaking during prolonged voyages. For the Crusaders, this meant that precious supplies of grain, arrows, and armor were far less likely to be ruined by seawater, and the troops would arrive less exhausted from constant bailing and miserable conditions. As one naval historian specializing in medieval maritime technology has pointed out, in an age before standardized naval architecture, the subtle refinements of a regional shipbuilding tradition like Ragusa's could yield outsized operational advantages. Their ships were the workhorses of the Adriatic, prized for their seaworthiness. The value of these advancements was demonstrated not in a grand fleet action, but in the countless unheralded missions that sustained the Fourth Crusade. There are accounts from chroniclers of the era noting the presence of Ragusan vessels performing critical, high-risk tasks that the larger, clumsier ships of other powers were ill-suited for. One anecdote tells of a Ragusan captain, known for his uncanny knowledge of the coastline, who was tasked with running a blockade to deliver an urgent message to Crusader leadership. Using his agile galley and taking advantage of a moonless night and his intimate knowledge of hidden coves and treacherous currents, he slipped past a much larger Venetian patrol ship that had been tasked with intercepting him. His success ensured that a critical tactical decision was communicated in time, preventing a potential disaster. On another occasion, a small squadron of Ragusan galleys was used as a rapid reaction force, ferrying knights from a main transport ship to a contested beachhead with speed and precision that larger vessels couldn't match. This turning point powerfully underscores how a small city-state, with no vast territories or immense armies, could exert a profound influence on a major historical event through the quiet application of specialized technological expertise. The Republic of Ragusa didn't need to command armies or rule kingdoms. It built better ships. In doing so, it amplified the strength of the entire Crusader logistical chain, ensuring that more men and material arrived where they were needed, when they were needed, and in a condition to fight. Their contribution was a testament to the idea that innovation, even on a small scale, could be a decisive force multiplier, making the daunting journey to the Holy Land just a little less perilous. It was a victory won not with swords, but with saws and adzes, proving that the path to Jerusalem was paved with well-crafted planks of oak. While the Ragusans were mastering the sea, the Crusader states on land were engaged in their own form of adaptation, learning that to defeat an enemy, you must first understand them. Nowhere was this pragmatic approach to warfare more evident than in the county of Tripoli, a realm that existed in a perpetual state of low-intensity conflict along the volatile frontier between the Crusader coast and the Syrian interior. Confronted by fast-moving Turkish and Bedouin forces that refused to engage in the kind of set-piece battles favored by European knights, the military leaders of Tripoli made a radical and unsung decision. They would stop trying to force their enemy to fight like them and would instead learn to fight like their enemy. This deliberate incorporation of Eastern military tactics, particularly the devastating art of horse archery and the use of fluid, flexible formations, transformed their army into a uniquely hybrid force, one that could finally meet its mobile adversaries on their own terms and win. The traditional Frankish way of war, centered on the devastating charge of the heavily armored knight, was a powerful but terribly inflexible instrument. It was designed to decide a battle in a single, thunderous moment of impact. Against the armies of Western Europe, it was often decisive, but in the Levant, it frequently met only empty air. Turkish and Arab generals, masters of tactical deception and maneuver, would simply refuse to give a solid target. They would harass the Crusader lines with clouds of arrows from a distance, feign retreats to break their formations, and lure overconfident charges into prepared ambushes. The county of Tripoli, with its long, exposed border and limited resources, could not afford the catastrophic losses that resulted from these failed engagements. Their survival depended on developing a new kind of army, one that could counter these elusive tactics. This is where the genius of cultural borrowing, a concept historian David Nicol has extensively detailed, came into play. The Franks of Tripoli, living in close proximity to a diverse population of Eastern Christians, Muslims, and other groups, had a front-row seat to a different military tradition. They began to observe and, more importantly, to recruit. They started to employ local Christian cavalrymen known as Turcopoles, who were masters of light horsemanship and the composite bow. These Turcopoles were not merely auxiliary scouts. They were integrated into the core of the army, forming a mobile screen that could protect the slow-moving Frankish knights from harassing arrows, chase down skirmishers, and execute their own flanking maneuvers. The Franks themselves began to adopt lighter armor for some of their cavalry, trading a degree of protection for the speed and endurance needed to keep pace with their new adversaries. The effectiveness of this military fusion was proven in spectacular fashion at the Battle of Montjussard in 1177. Though often remembered as a miraculous victory for the leper King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the forces of Tripoli played a crucial role, and their tactics were a key component of the success. Facing the vast army of Saladin himself, the outnumbered Crusaders could not afford a static defense. As Saladin's forces advanced, the Turcopoles and lighter Frankish cavalry from Tripoli were unleashed. They did not charge headlong. Instead, they operated on the flanks, using their horse archery to pepper the advancing Muslim ranks, disrupting their cohesion and sowing confusion. This constant, stinging harassment prevented Saladin from bringing his full numerical superiority to bear in an organized way. It created openings, pockets of disorder that the main body of Frankish knights, held in reserve until the perfect moment, could then exploit with their signature heavy charge. The victory at Montjussard was not won by knights alone. It was won by the seamless combination of Eastern-style mobility and harassment with Western-style shock power, a hybrid formula that Tripoli had been perfecting for years. This tactical evolution had outcomes that extended far beyond a single battlefield. By becoming more flexible, the army of Tripoli became far more cost-effective. A force that could win with maneuver and intelligence required fewer of the prohibitively expensive knights and men-at-arms. It could protect a longer border with fewer men, and it could engage in the kind of persistent, low-level warfare that defined life on the frontier without constantly risking a catastrophic defeat. The adoption of these foreign methods was the ultimate form of military pragmatism. It demonstrated that the minor Crusader kingdoms, unburdened by the rigid feudal traditions of Europe, could enhance their effectiveness and ensure their survival not through isolation, but through a profound and open-minded engagement with the world around them. They learned that the best way to defend their European identity was to willingly embrace the best of Eastern practice, creating a new, more resilient form of warfare born from the very land they sought to hold. This military flexibility, however, stood in stark contrast to the rigid feudal structures that governed their daily lives, structures that were about to be challenged not by an external enemy, but by the people within their own walls. For decades, the great fortified cities of the Crusader states had been run like military garrisons, their governance a top-down affair dictated by a small class of European-born feudal lords who often seemed more interested in their own privileges and petty squabbles than in the practical needs of their bustling, multicultural domain. This disconnect between the rulers and the ruled reached a boiling point in the spring of 1232 within the walls of Acre, the de facto capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Here, the very people who formed the economic lifeblood of the Crusader project, the merchants, the skilled artisans, the ship captains, and the middle-class burghers, staged a dramatic and unprecedented revolt against their feudal masters. This was not a riot, it was a calculated political insurrection that led to the creation of the Commune of Acre, a revolutionary experiment in self-governance that would, against all odds, forge a more stable and efficient administration precisely when the Crusader states needed it most. The socioeconomic factors fueling this uprising had been simmering for a generation. Acre was a teeming, cosmopolitan metropolis, a chaotic melting pot of Italians, Franks, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and Muslims, all drawn by the lucrative trade that flowed through its harbors. The wealth of this city was not generated by the landed aristocracy in their countryside castles. It was created by the commercial class within the city walls. These merchants and craftsmen chafed under a feudal system that seemed archaic and unjust. They were heavily taxed to fund the endless wars of the nobility, yet they had no say in how those wars were fought or how their taxes were spent. Their commercial disputes were settled in courts dominated by noblemen who knew little of maritime law or complex trade agreements. Furthermore, the constant political instability, as rival noble factions like the Ibelins and their opponents vied for control of the regency for the young king, directly threatened the stable environment necessary for business to thrive. The chronicler Philip of Novara, who was himself deeply involved in the period's politics, captures this frustration, noting that the common citizens and merchants grew weary of the pride and folly of the barons, whose incessant conflicts jeopardized the security and prosperity of everyone. The revolt itself was a masterclass in urban organization. The leaders of the movement, likely drawn from the wealthiest merchant families and the heads of the powerful artisan guilds, organized a sworn association, a commune binding its members by a sacred oath to stand together against aristocratic overreach. They effectively seized control of the city's government, ejecting the officials appointed by the feudal regent and establishing their own council to administer Acre. This was a direct challenge to the very foundation of feudal society, where power descended from god to king to lord. In the Commune of Acre, power now flowed upward from the collective will of the citizenry. This bold move did not go uncontested. It sparked a brief civil war within the kingdom, pitting the communal forces of Acre, who were supported by the Genos and some of the military orders, against the feudal army loyal to the regent. The Commune's very existence was a declaration that the people who did the work, who generated the wealth, and who ultimately defended the walls had a right to a voice in their own destiny. The most remarkable outcome of this upheaval was not the conflict it ignited, but the surprising stability and efficiency it ultimately fostered. Once the Commune's authority was grudgingly accepted, its new governance structure proved to be remarkably effective. The council, composed of practical men with a direct stake in the city's well-being, implemented a series of crucial reforms. They streamlined the chaotic and corrupt customs collection process, ensuring tariffs were gathered fairly, and the revenues were actually spent on public works and defense rather than siphoned off by greedy officials. They established more transparent and specialized courts to handle commercial disputes, which encouraged trade and attracted more merchants to the city. Perhaps most importantly, they managed the city's resources with a miser's care, ensuring that grain stores were maintained, fortifications were repaired, and militias were properly funded and organized. This created a period of internal stability and good governance that made Acre a more reliable base for Crusader operations for decades to come. This internal change stands as a powerful testament to how grassroots movements within a minor realm could redirect the entire Crusader enterprise toward greater efficiency. The Commune of Acre demonstrated that the path to resilience was not always through stronger lords or taller walls, but sometimes through more responsive and practical governance. By empowering the local voices who understood the daily realities of trade, finance, and urban life, Acre forged a system that was better equipped to manage the complex challenges of survival in the Levant. It was a quiet revolution from within, proving that the will of the people could be as formidable a force as any foreign army. And just as human conflict reshaped the political landscape, an event of unimaginable natural power was about to strike, testing the very foundations of the Crusader world and forcing a cooperation no treaty could ever mandate. On the 10th of June in the year 1170, the very earth beneath the Principality of Antioch seemed to revolt. A catastrophic earthquake, one of the most powerful of the medieval period, struck without warning. In the city of Antioch, the ground heaved and tore apart, and the air filled with the roar of collapsing masonry. The great walls, the proud churches, and the sturdy houses that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in a matter of moments. The death toll was horrifying, numbering in the thousands, and the physical heart of the most powerful Crusader state in the north was utterly shattered. In the face of this unimaginable disaster, the very survival of Antioch was thrown into doubt. Yet, from the dust and despair emerged an unexpected opportunity, not just to rebuild stone and mortar, but to reforge broken alliances and reimagine the city's defenses, transforming a natural catastrophe into a strategic turning point that would redefine cooperation in the Levant. The scale of the destruction was so immense that no single power, not even a resurgent Antioch, could hope to address it alone. This profound vulnerability became the catalyst for one of the most remarkable displays of cross-cultural solidarity of the entire Crusader era. Almost immediately, aid began to flow from surprising quarters. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, despite his often fraught political relationship with the Franks of Antioch, dispatched a massive shipment of gold, along with a corps of his finest military engineers and architects. This was not merely charity, it was a calculated investment in the stability of a crucial buffer state on his empire's southeastern frontier. He understood that a weak and ruined Antioch was an open invitation to Nur ad-Din's forces from Aleppo. Simultaneously, from the mountains of Cilicia, King Emlay of Armenia, whose relationship with the Franks was often openly hostile, sent teams of stonemasons, supplies of timber, and a contingent of his own skilled laborers. For the Armenian kingdom, a strong Antioch was a vital shield against the same Muslim powers that threatened their own existence. Even the Knights Hospitaller and Templar, whose resources were stretched thin, committed funds and manpower to the rebuilding effort. The earthquake had, for a brief moment, silenced the usual din of political squabbling and reminded everyone of a shared geopolitical interest that transcended their differences. This collaborative spirit gave birth to an unprecedented wave of engineering innovation. The reconstruction was not about simply replicating what was lost. It was a chance to build back better, smarter, and stronger. The collaboration between Byzantine, Frankish, and Armenian engineers created a fascinating fusion of architectural knowledge. Byzantine experts brought their mastery of complex vaulting and dome construction, techniques that could create larger, more stable internal spaces for gates and towers. The Franks contributed their practical experience with the latest in European castle design, emphasizing tall, thick curtains walls and deadly flanking fire from projecting towers. The Armenians, who had centuries of experience building in an earthquake-prone region, introduced crucial anti-seismic features. Archaeologists studying the remnants of Antioch's walls have pointed to evidence of these innovations: deeper and more flexible foundations, the use of wooden beam tie-ins within stonework to allow for some movement, and a more trapezoidal shape to towers and gatehouses that could better distribute seismic forces. The famous Iron Gate Bridge was completely redesigned with stronger supports, and the entire circuit of walls was not just repaired but significantly expanded and reinforced in key sectors, particularly along the more vulnerable southern approaches. The cooperation forged in the crucible of this disaster did not end when the last stone was set. The shared endeavor created a network of trust and a habit of consultation that lasted for years. Military intelligence was more freely shared between Antioch, Armenia, and the Byzantine outposts in Cilicia. Joint patrols along the threatened borders became more common. When a new Turkish threat emerged from the east a few years later, the response was notably more coordinated than it would have been before the earthquake. The memory of working side by side to raise the walls made it easier to stand shoulder to shoulder to defend them. The crisis had forced a pragmatic realization that their individual security was inextricably linked. This period of collaboration bought Antioch several additional decades of life, allowing it to remain a powerful Christian bulwark long after it might otherwise have succumbed to its many enemies and internal divisions. This 17th turning point stands as a powerful lesson in how a shared calamity can become an unexpected catalyst for unity and strategic innovation. The earthquake of 1170 was a horrific event that brought immense suffering, but the response to it revealed a deeper truth about the Levant. When faced with an existential threat, be it from nature or a human enemy, the instinct for survival could momentarily override the divisions of creed and culture. The rebuilt walls of Antioch were more than just a physical barrier. They were a monument to a fleeting but potent moment of cooperation, a testament to the idea that sometimes the only way to withstand the tremors of history is to find strength in the most unlikely of alliances. And while engineers from three kingdoms found common cause in stone and mortar, another, far quieter form of bridge building was taking place on the harsh frontier of the Lordship of Oultrejordain, where survival increasingly depended not on the strength of walls but on the precise meaning of words. Stretching east from the Dead Sea into the harsh, arid landscapes of what is now modern Jordan, the Lordship of Oultrejordain was the wild frontier of the Crusader world. This was not a land of lush farms or bustling port cities. It was a vast, sparsely populated buffer zone, a brittle shield protecting the wealthy heartlands of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the powerful Muslim empires of Egypt and Syria. Its value was not in its productivity, but in its geography. It controlled the vital caravan routes that brought spices, silks, and incense from the east to the markets of the Mediterranean. For the lords who ruled this precarious territory, survival depended less on the strength of their castles like the mighty Kerak and Montreal, and more on a skill that was often undervalued by their European counterparts: the subtle, precise art of communication. In this volatile environment, the most crucial figures in the Lord's retinue were not his most heavily armored knights, but his Arabic interpreters, men whose linguistic prowess became a more powerful weapon than any siege engine in preserving a fragile peace. The strategic importance of clear, unambiguous communication in this border region cannot be overstated. A misunderstood phrase, a cultural slight, or a mistranslated demand could instantly escalate a tense standoff into a full-blown military incident, triggering a war that neither side may have actually wanted. The lords of Oultrejordain, living in a state of perpetual low-grade tension, understood this intimately. They operated in a complex diplomatic ecosystem where alliances shifted with the seasons, and today's enemy could be tomorrow's necessary ally against a common foe. In this world, an interpreter was not a mere translator. He was a diplomat, a cultural advisor, and an intelligence agent all rolled into one. These were often men of mixed heritage, or local Christians who were fluent in both Old French and Arabic, and they possessed an innate understanding of the complex etiquette and nuanced language required to negotiate with Muslim emirs and Bedouin sheikhs. A chronicler of the era, himself likely reliant on such skilled individuals, noted that a man who can speak with the enemy in his own tongue holds the key to the gate, for he can open it to peace or lock it fast with war. This linguistic strategy yielded its most valuable returns in the negotiation of truces, the lifeblood of Oultrejordain's existence. One particularly illuminating example unfolded during the reign of the formidable Lord Philip of Millie. A dispute over grazing rights and water access for Bedouin tribes who nominally owed allegiance to Damascus had spiraled into a series of bloody raids and counter-raids. The Emir of Damascus, seeing an opportunity to apply pressure, began massing troops, threatening a full-scale invasion in retaliation for the attacks on his subjects. Lord Philip could have chosen to fortify his castles and prepare for a siege, a costly and risky endeavor. Instead, he dispatched his most trusted interpreter, a man familiar with the specific dialects and tribal customs of the region, to open a channel of communication directly with the Bedouin leaders, bypassing the Damascene court entirely. Through a series of carefully negotiated parleys held in the open desert, the interpreter was able to articulate Philip's position while also conveying the Bedouins' grievances back to Kerak. He clarified misunderstandings, identified a mutual interest in maintaining the lucrative caravan traffic, and helped draft a detailed agreement on seasonal grazing zones and well access. This localized truce effectively removed the emir's pretext for war, causing the Damascene army to stand down. A major conflict was averted not by a victory in battle, but by a victory in translation. The benefits of this expertly managed diplomacy extended far beyond the immediate prevention of wars. By securing these temporary but renewable truces, the Lordship of Oultrejordain guaranteed the safety of the caravan routes that were the economic jugular of the entire region. Taxes levied on this trade provided a steady and immense source of revenue not just for Kerak, but for the royal treasury in Jerusalem itself. The wealth that built the cathedrals and funded the armies of the kingdom was, in no small part, underwritten by the negotiated peace achieved on its most dangerous frontier. Furthermore, these channels of communication served as vital conduits for intelligence. Interpreters moving between courts and camps were perfectly positioned to gather information on troop movements, political instability within Muslim realms, and the intentions of powerful leaders like Saladin. This early warning system provided the Crusader kingdoms with precious time to prepare their defenses, making the interpreter's ear as important as any watchman's eyes. This 18th turning point stands as a brilliant example of how a minor, frontier lordship could leverage a soft skill to perform an outsized strategic role for the entire Crusader effort. The lords of Oultrejordain realized that on a border where cultural lines blurred, the most durable fortifications were not made of stone but of trust built through words. They acted as the essential diplomatic bridge between the Latin East and the Muslim world, a role the more insulated nobility in Jerusalem or Acre were often ill-equipped to play. Their use of skilled interpreters transformed potential flashpoints into opportunities for negotiation, proving that in the right hands, a nuanced understanding of language and custom could be the most potent force for stability in a land perpetually on the brink of war. While these linguistic experts were safeguarding health through peace, another group of dedicated individuals within the Crusader world was engaged in a more direct form of preservation, working to heal the body itself through innovations that would save countless lives. Amidst the clash of swords and the thunder of siege engines, a quieter, more humane battle was being waged within the hallowed halls of the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. While the Knights Hospitaller are often remembered for their military prowess, their most enduring and life-saving contribution to the Crusader cause was not forged on the battlefield, but in the infirmary. This specialized institution, operating from its vast complex in the heart of Jerusalem, became a beacon of medical innovation in an age of staggering mortality, a place where the science of healing advanced through a remarkable and unprecedented exchange of knowledge between Latin, Arab, and Jewish medical traditions. The survival of countless crusaders, from lowly foot soldiers to powerful barons, depended on the treatments perfected here, making the hospital's medical contributions a strategic asset every bit as vital as any castle or army in sustaining the Latin presence in the East. The scale of the Hospital of St. John was staggering, a medieval medical city within a city. At its peak in the 12th century, it could accommodate up to 2,000 patients simultaneously, a number that would not be rivaled in Europe for centuries. These were not just crusaders. The hospital treated people of all faiths. Muslim and Jewish patients received the same care as Latin Christians, a level of medical inclusivity that was virtually unheard of elsewhere. This policy was not merely charitable, it was profoundly pragmatic. It facilitated a continuous and open exchange of medical knowledge, creating a unique environment where the best practices of East and West could merge and evolve. Arab and Jewish doctors, drawing on centuries of scholarship that had preserved and expanded upon the work of Greek pioneers like Galen and Hippocrates, worked alongside their Western counterparts, who brought their own practical experience in treating the traumatic wounds of warfare. This cross-cultural collaboration was the engine of the hospital's innovation, transforming it from a simple place of refuge into the most advanced medical center in the Christian world. The innovations that emerged from this fusion were nothing short of revolutionary. In the critical field of surgery, the hospital's physicians developed new techniques for treating the wounds that were the daily reality of Crusader life. They perfected methods for cleaning and debriding traumatic injuries to prevent the gangrene that was so often a death sentence. They made advances in amputations, understanding the importance of swift, precise procedures, and the use of cauterization to minimize blood loss and shock. But perhaps their most significant breakthrough was in the then arcane science of hygiene. While European medicine was still mired in miasma theory and a general disregard for cleanliness, the hospital staff, learning from Islamic medical texts that emphasized the importance of purifying the environment, implemented rigorous sanitary protocols. They maintained a constant supply of clean linens, ensured fresh air circulated through the vast wards, and understood the necessity of isolating patients with contagious diseases. As one medical historian specializing in the period has noted, the Hospital of St. John operated on principles of hygiene and organized patient care that were centuries ahead of their time. They empirically understood the connection between cleanliness and recovery long before the germ theory of disease was ever conceived. The impact of these advancements on the Crusader military machine was direct and profound. A soldier who survived his wounds due to superior surgical care and a clean recovery environment was a soldier who could fight again. This drastically reduced the catastrophic loss of experienced manpower that plagued medieval armies, where infection routinely killed more men than enemy blades. The hospital's role extended beyond the walls of Jerusalem. It became a model that was systematically exported. Smaller, satellite hospitals and infirmaries were established in other major Crusader strongholds, from Acre to Antioch, and they all operated according to the standardized regulations and medical practices developed at the mother house. Knights and sergeants of the order trained in this medical system accompanied Crusader armies on campaign, bringing field hospitals and a level of medical support that was unimaginable to their adversaries. This network of care created a tangible strategic advantage, boosting morale among the ranks. Men fought with greater confidence, knowing that if they fell, they had a far better chance of receiving expert care than they would anywhere else in the world. This 19th turning point powerfully illustrates how a single specialized institution, embedded within the context of a larger order, could generate an outsized impact that reverberated across the entire Crusader enterprise. The Hospital of St. John was more than just a charity. It was a center of excellence that leveraged the multicultural reality of the Levant to produce life-saving innovations. Its work ensured that the human capital of the Crusader states, the thousands of men who provided their military strength, was not squandered needlessly. By dramatically improving survival rates, it indirectly sustained military campaigns for decades, proving that the pen, or in this case the scalpel and the clean bandage, could be as mighty as the sword. Yet, even the most advanced medical care required immense financial resources to sustain, a reality that would soon lead to another, more surprising form of cross-cultural cooperation, one conducted not in the infirmary but in the counting house. While the healers of St. John were preserving the fighting strength of the Crusaders one patient at a time, another military order was mastering a different kind of preservation, safeguarding not the health of men, but the financial health of entire kingdoms. As the 13th century waned and the shadow of the Mamluk Sultanate grew longer, the kingdom of Cilician Armenia found itself in a desperate position. This Christian bastion, a crucial buffer state in northeastern Asia Minor, was facing an existential threat from the relentless expansion of Mamluk power. Raising and equipping armies to defend its mountainous passes required immense sums of money, a resource the Armenian treasury, drained by decades of warfare, simply did not have. In this moment of crisis, they turned to an unlikely source for salvation, not a king or an emperor, but a bank. The Knights Templar, through their vast and sophisticated international financial network, began providing massive loans to the Armenian crown, a flow of credit that would become the single most important factor in prolonging the kingdom's survival for another generation. This relationship was built on a foundation of profound economic interdependence, a symbiotic partnership between a military order with unparalleled financial resources and a kingdom with immense strategic value. The Templars were far more than just warrior monks. They were the preeminent bankers of the Latin East, operating a sprawling transnational financial institution that moved vast sums of money between Europe and Outremer. Pilgrims and crusaders could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in London or Paris and withdraw the equivalent amount in Acre or Jerusalem, using letters of credit that were the medieval equivalent of travelers' checks. This system generated enormous capital reserves, which the order then leveraged for lending. For the Kingdom of Armenia, the Templars were the only institution with both the liquidity to fund a national defense and the long-term strategic interest in seeing a Christian ally survive. As the economic historian Nicholas Vincent has articulated, the military orders became the central banks of the Crusader states. Their ability to extend credit was often the difference between a successful campaign and a catastrophic retreat. They monetized piety, turning the wealth of European donors into the hard currency needed to pay soldiers and build walls in the east. The specific loans extended to the Armenian kingdom were not trivial sums. They were the equivalent of national bailouts designed to address critical strategic vulnerabilities. One well-documented instance involved the fortification of the strategic Sis Pass, a key invasion route into the Armenian heartland. Facing an imminent Mamluk offensive in 1281, King Leo III of Armenia secured a colossal loan from the Templar fortress at Bagras. The terms, recorded in a fragmentary charter, stipulated that the funds were to be used exclusively for the strengthening of the royal fortresses in the Syrian gates. This injection of capital allowed Leo to hire a small army of skilled Armenian and Frankish stonemasons and engineers for a full year, who worked tirelessly to reinforce the walls of the citadels guarding the pass. They built higher towers, deeper ditches, and more sophisticated barbicans, transforming a vulnerable point into a formidable obstacle. When the Mamluk force finally arrived, they found the defenses so much stronger than anticipated that they broke off their assault after a brief and costly probe, choosing to redirect their efforts elsewhere. This single loan and the construction it funded had effectively saved the kingdom from a potentially devastating invasion. The strategic effects of this financial lifeline were multifaceted and profound. With Templar gold financing their defenses, the Armenian army could remain in the field for longer periods. The kingdom could afford to hire expensive but highly effective mercenary companies, like the skilled crossbowmen from Antioch, to supplement its own troops. Perhaps most importantly, this access to credit provided stability. Knowing that funds were available to meet a crisis allowed the Armenian kings to plan for the long term rather than simply react to immediate threats. This financial security fostered a period of renewed resistance that forced the Mamluks to commit significant resources to the Armenian front, resources that otherwise would have been directed against the final remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Templar loans effectively made the Armenian kingdom a more persistent and costly thorn in the side of the Sultanate, buying precious time for the entire Crusader project. This 20th turning point reveals a crucial and often overlooked dimension of medieval warfare. The battlefield was often won or lost in the ledgers long before the first arrow was ever fired. The Knights Templar, through their role as international financiers, demonstrated that economic networks could be weaponized to redirect military capabilities on a grand scale. Their decision to extend credit to a struggling ally was a strategic investment that altered the balance of power in the Levant, proving that the most powerful fortress was sometimes not one made of stone, but one built on a foundation of solid credit and liquid capital. This financial engineering provided a shield of gold for Armenia, But even the most robust economy needed something more to sustain a nation's spirit, a shared sense of identity and common purpose that could be forged not in the counting house, but in the shared experience of collective celebration. In the midst of political squabbles and the constant threat of invasion, the city of Jerusalem possessed a weapon of unity more powerful than any decree from a king or treaty between barons: the annual celebration of Easter. For a few sacred days each spring, the profound spiritual significance of the city itself, the site of Christ's passion and resurrection, temporarily overrode the deep-seated divisions that chronically plagued the Crusader elite. The festival, meticulously organized by the local clergy of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and often financially supported by nearby minor kingdoms like Cyprus or Armenian Cilicia, became a mandatory pause in the factional fighting, a collective drawing of breath that reminded everyone of the sacred purpose that had, in theory, brought them all to the Levant in the first place. The religious and social power of this gathering was immense and multifaceted. For the often isolated Frankish settlers and the weary knights who manned the lonely frontier castles, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Easter was a powerful reaffirmation of their identity. It was a chance to physically reconnect with the core of their faith, to walk the Via Dolorosa and pray at the empty tomb, experiences that rejuvenated their sense of mission. For the diverse population of the city, Italians, Provençals, Germans, local Eastern Christians, and even a few Muslim and Jewish residents, the festival created a shared, city-wide experience. The streets filled with processions, the air rang with bells and chants in a dozen different languages, and a palpable sense of collective anticipation built towards Easter morning. Cultural historians have long emphasized that in medieval society, ritual was not merely symbolic. It was a constitutive force that shaped reality and reinforced social bonds. The Easter rituals in Jerusalem did exactly that, temporarily weaving the disparate threads of Crusader society into a single tapestry of shared devotion, making abstract concepts like Christendom and the Holy Land feel tangibly real and worth defending together. This atmosphere of unity had direct and practical political benefits. The Easter gathering served as an unofficial, yet essential, annual summit for the leadership of Outremer. With all the major barons, military order masters, and senior church officials present in the city at the same time, the festival became a crucial opportunity for behind-the-scenes diplomacy and strategic planning. Away from the formal and often contentious high court, discussions could happen in cloisters, over shared meals, or while observing the processions. One chronicler tells an anecdote of the influential Ibelin family using the Easter festivities in 1225 to quietly lobby other nobles and the Patriarch of Jerusalem for support against their rival, the Emperor Frederick II's regent. The shared sacred context made these conversations less confrontational. It was harder to outright refuse a fellow baron you had just received communion alongside. Agreements forged or understandings reached during this period of heightened religious solidarity often held firm long after the festival ended, providing a foundation for coordinated military action or administrative cooperation in the coming year. This turning point stands as a brilliant example of how cultural and religious practices, orchestrated by local, non-state actors like the clergy, and supported by minor kingdoms seeking stability, could perform a vital political function that direct command often could not. The Easter festival was a tool of soft power that strengthened collective resolve by reminding a fractured society of its common identity and common goal. It provided a regular, institutionalized moment for reconciliation and planning, acting as a necessary pressure valve for the tensions that constantly threatened to tear the Crusader states apart from within. This hard-won unity, however, was always fragile, and there would come moments when the stark realities of warfare would demand not a gathering together, but a deliberate, painful pulling apart. The fall of the county of Edessa in 1144 stands as one of the most catastrophic blows in Crusader history, the event that triggered the entire Second Crusade and sent shockwaves through Christendom. The standard narrative is one of utter defeat, a story that ends with the triumphant Zengi storming the citadel and the Frankish presence in Mesopotamia being extinguished overnight. But hidden within this tale of collapse is a far more nuanced and strategically significant story, a story not of a mindless rout, but of a deliberate, managed withdrawal that, even in the moment of its own destruction, managed to salvage enough strength to grant its sister states a crucial lease on life. This was not a surrender, it was a tragic yet calculated trade, sacrificing a kingdom to save the broader Crusader project. As Zengi's massive army tightened its noose around Edessa, the defenders faced an impossible choice. The city's legendary walls, once its greatest asset, had been critically weakened by mining operations and relentless bombardment. A fight to the last man, while glorious in song, would have resulted in the complete annihilation of the county's entire ruling class, its military elite, and its vast treasury, a total loss that would have delivered a death blow to Crusader morale and left a priceless hoard of weapons, relics, and coin in Zengi's hands. Inside the besieged citadel, a fierce and desperate debate must have raged. The chronicler William of Tyre, though writing later, captures the essence of such command dilemmas, noting that leaders in the East often had to choose between the honor of a vain resistance and the practical necessity of preserving strength for a future day. The controversial decision, likely made by the senior Latin and Armenian commanders present, was to execute a fighting retreat. While a rearguard desperately held the main gates, the core of the garrison, along with Count Jocelyn's family, keen knights, church officials, and as much of the royal treasury and sacred relics as they could carry, were funneled out through a network of postern gates and subterranean passages known only to the local Armenian defenders. This tactical exodus had immediate and profound benefits. The personnel who escaped were the institutional memory and military expertise of the entire northeastern frontier. These veteran knights and sergeants did not simply vanish. They streamed west towards Antioch and Tripoli. Their arrival provided an instant and massive infusion of hardened, combat-experienced troops to these critically threatened states. A chronicle from the monastery of St. Mary in Antioch specifically notes the arrival of a great company of men from Edessa, grim of face but stout of heart, who were immediately integrated into the Principality's defenses. Furthermore, the salvaged wealth of Edessa's treasury provided the liquid capital needed to fund urgent repairs to Antioch's walls, hire additional mercenaries, and provision castles that were now on the front line. The sacred relics, including a fragment of the true cross from Edessa's cathedral, were not just spiritually significant. Their transfer to Antioch provided a massive morale boost and reaffirmed the city's status as a spiritual center for Christendom in the East, helping to steady nerves in the wake of the disaster. The long-term strategic impact of this managed withdrawal is a point emphasized by military historians who study the broader calculus of medieval warfare. As the renowned strategist B.H. Liddell-Hart argued, the true aim of a commander is not to die with honor, but to make the enemy die for his cause. A strategic retreat is not a negation of will, but its concentration on a more defensible point. The escape from Edessa was a textbook example of this principle. The men and material saved directly contributed to the defense of Antioch, which successfully weathered the immediate storm of Zengi's follow-up offensive. Their experience also provided a brutal, first-hand lesson in the effectiveness of Turkish siege mining, knowledge that was then used to improve the counter-mining defenses of every major Crusader castle from cracked des Chevaliers to the walls of Jerusalem itself. The very concept of planning for a staged withdrawal, of having pre-designated escape routes and a protocol for evacuating key assets, became a standard part of defensive planning for the other Crusader states. They learned from Edessa's fall that a fortress could have a purpose even in its loss, if that loss could be made to bleed the enemy and preserve strength for the overall war. This 22nd turning point forces us to redefine what constitutes a victory and a defeat. The county of Edessa was unquestionably conquered, its territory lost forever. Yet, through the grim pragmatism of its final hours, it achieved a paradoxical form of success. Its sacrifice was not in vain because it was not a complete offering. By choosing a controlled burn over a total inferno, the leaders of Edessa managed to redirect the core of their kingdom's strength into reinforcing the remaining Crusader states, granting them the resilience to survive for another century and a half. It is a powerful testament to the idea that even in the moment of its own annihilation, a minor kingdom could perform one final, vital service, proving that the most difficult retreat could sometimes be the most important advance for the broader cause. While the desperate retreat from Edessa demonstrated the grim wisdom of knowing when to fall back, the earlier success of the Crusader states often hinged on the opposite skill, the ability to break through seemingly impregnable defenses. In the brutal, grinding warfare of the Levant, the difference between a swift victory and a prolonged, bloody siege could often be measured in the quality of an army's siege engines. For the newly established Principality of Antioch, mastering this technology was a matter of survival, and their key teacher was the most advanced military power in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire. The transfer of cutting-edge siege engine technology, particularly the formidable trebuchet, from Byzantine engineers to the Frankish forces of Antioch, represents a pivotal moment where knowledge proved more decisive than raw courage, giving the Crusaders a crucial technological edge that would help them secure their foothold in the Holy Land. The capture of the formidable fortress of Margat and Neumann in December of 1098 stands as a brutal testament to the effectiveness of this technological exchange. After the epic siege of Antioch, the Crusader army, now under the command of Bohemond of Taranto, was exhausted, starving, and desperately in need of a victory to secure the surrounding countryside. Margat and Neumann was a classic Syrian stronghold with high, thick walls manned by a determined garrison. A direct assault would have been suicidal, and a protracted blockade was a luxury the starving Crusaders did not have. Their only hope was to smash the walls down quickly. Fortunately for them, they now had access to a new class of weapon, massive, counterweight trebuchets, machines of a scale and sophistication they had not possessed when they first arrived in the East. These were not the smaller, traction trebuchets powered by teams of men pulling on ropes that were common in Europe. These were the latest in Byzantine military engineering, machines that used the immense, relentless power of a counterweight to huge projectiles with terrifying force and accuracy. The engineers and artisans who facilitated this transfer were the unsung heroes of the siege. They were likely a mixed group, Byzantine specialists who may have been attached to the Crusader army as technical advisors following their cooperation at Antioch, and perhaps even local Christian or Muslim engineers who were familiar with the principles of the machines and were now in the employ of the Prince of Antioch. These men were the medieval equivalent of combat engineers, a professional class whose expertise was every bit as valuable as that of a skilled knight. They would have directed the construction of the massive machines, selecting the right types of wood for the throwing arm and frame, meticulously assembling the complex counterweight box, and calibrating the machine's release mechanism for maximum power. Their most critical role was in the art of aiming, a skill that required an intuitive understanding of physics and ballistics. They would calculate the weight of the stone projectile, the amount of counterweight, and the angle of release to ensure each shot landed on the same section of wall, methodically pounding it until the masonry cracked and crumbled. Historians of technology like Michael Basister have pointed out that this period represented a revolutionary leap in siege warfare. The transfer of knowledge wasn't merely about providing blueprints, it was about teaching an entire methodology. The Byzantines had inherited and refined Roman engineering principles, and their approach was one of systematic application. They understood that a successful siege was an engineering project. The improvements made to these machines in the Crusader context were often pragmatic adaptations. The Franks, learning from their Byzantine tutors and their own harsh experience, began to focus on rate of fire and mobility. They developed prefabricated components that could be transported by wagon and assembled more quickly on site, reducing the time defenders had to sortie and burn the engines. They also experimented with different projectile types. While large stones were used to breach walls, they also launched smaller stones in high arcs to clear battlements of defenders, and even launched the gruesome and psychological weapon of severed heads into the city to terrorize the inhabitants. This technological exchange is a profound demonstration of how a minor kingdom like Antioch acted as a crucial conduit for advanced knowledge. Isolated and surrounded, the Principality could not afford to be technologically stagnant. Its survival depended on its ability to learn, adapt, and implement the best practices of the diverse cultures around it. By embracing Byzantine siegecraft, Antioch didn't just acquire a new weapon, it absorbed a new way of thinking about warfare, one that valued engineering precision and scientific application of force over pure brute strength. This advantage allowed them to punch far above their weight, capturing strongholds that would have otherwise been immune to their attacks. The fall of Margat and Neumann, horrific as its aftermath was, proved that in the harsh arithmetic of medieval conquest, a well-built machine in the hands of a skilled crew could be worth 1,000 knights. This mastery over the built environment gave the Crusaders the power to reshape the landscape to their will, a power that would soon be tested against the most unyielding and elemental forces of nature itself. While the Crusader states often looked to walls and treaties for their security, some of their most reliable defenders were not built by human hands but carved by nature itself. Flowing from the snowy slopes of Mount Hermon down to the stark depression of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River served as a living, moving frontier for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a natural moat that defined its eastern border and presented a formidable obstacle to any army marching out of the deserts of Syria and Arabia. This was not a static line on a map, but a dynamic environmental system, and the kingdom's survival often hinged on its ability to understand and control this powerful aquatic boundary. The immense responsibility for managing this natural fortress did not fall to the royal army in Jerusalem, but to the minor yet critically important lordships that stood directly in its path, most notably the Lordship of Oultrejordain, or the land beyond the Jordan. The hydrological advantages offered by the Jordan were both obvious and subtle. At its most basic level, the river was a physical barrier. During the rainy winter and spring seasons, its flow could become a raging torrent, transforming from a manageable stream into a wide, fast-moving, and treacherous body of water that was utterly impassable for large formations of troops, horses, and supply wagons. This seasonal flooding created a predictable window of security, a natural truce that shielded the kingdom for months at a time. But the river's defense went far deeper than its current. The land it flowed through, the Jordan Rift Valley, was a geographical marvel, a steep, dramatic gorge that plunged to well below sea level. This topography meant that any army approaching from the east faced a grueling, exhausting descent into a scorching basin, only to be confronted by the river itself, and then faced an even more arduous climb up the western escarpment under the watchful eyes of Crusader garrisons. As one historical geographer specializing in the region notes, rivers in medieval warfare were not just lines to be crossed, they were entire zones of control. The Jordan was a topographical nightmare for an invader, combining a water obstacle with extreme changes in elevation and a hostile climate, making any crossing operation a protracted and vulnerable endeavor. The true masters of this zone of control were the lords of Oultrejordain, operating from their immense, brooding strongholds of Carac and Montreal. These castles were not merely defensive redoubts, they were the control towers for the entire river system. Their strategic genius lay in their placement. They were built not right on the riverbank where they could be isolated, but high on the plateau to the east, giving them a commanding view of the valley and the few viable fords below. The lords and their local scouts possessed an intimate, granular knowledge of the river's moods and secrets. They knew every reliable ford, like the one near the ancient site of Bethany beyond the Jordan, but more importantly, they knew how these fords changed with the seasons, appearing and vanishing with the rise and fall of the waters. They understood where the banks were firm enough to support the weight of a cavalry squadron, and where they were soft, boggy traps that could swallow entire supply carts. This local intelligence was their ultimate weapon. This expertise was put to the test on numerous occasions, but one of the most illustrative examples occurred during the reign of Saladin. In 1183, the Sultan sought to bring his full force to bear on the kingdom's heartland. To do this, he needed to cross the Jordan. Rather than attempt a risky, opposed crossing at a known ford, he tried to outmaneuver the defenders by marching his army far to the south, seeking a less guarded crossing point. However, the Lord of Transjordan, Raynald of Chatillon, and his network of scouts and informants tracked the army's movement. Anticipating Saladin's intended crossing point, Raynald did not commit his limited forces to a direct confrontation on the eastern bank. Instead, he allowed the Mamluks to begin their difficult crossing, a process that strung their army out and made it desperately vulnerable. Once a significant portion of the force was trapped on the western bank, separated from the rest by the rushing current, Raynald's cavalry launched a devastating attack from the high ground. They could not destroy the entire army, but they inflicted heavy casualties, captured valuable supplies, and most importantly, threw Saladin's meticulously planned invasion into disarray, forcing him to abort the campaign. The river itself had become a tactical ally, dividing the enemy army and allowing a smaller defending force to achieve a disproportionate victory. This environmental strategy stands as a brilliant example of how a minor frontier lordship, by leveraging its deep, intimate knowledge of local geography, could provide an indispensable service to a larger entity. The Lordship of Oultrejordain did not have the manpower to defeat a sultan's army in open battle, but it didn't need to. Its purpose was to act as a goalkeeper, using the natural obstacle of the Jordan Valley and the choke points of its castles to deny easy access, channel invaders into kill zones, and bleed them long before they ever reached the valuable cities of the coast. They proved that a kingdom's best defense could sometimes be a well-understood river and the shrewd lords who knew how to use it. This mastery of the physical landscape provided a crucial layer of security, but for the Crusader states to achieve true longevity, they needed more than just strong borders. They needed a strong and stable system of governance from within, a framework of laws that could bring order to their diverse and often fractious realms. Amidst the chaos of war and the constant threat of invasion, One of the most enduring and overlooked innovations of the Crusader states was not a new type of sword or a taller castle wall, but something far more foundational, a system of laws. In the bustling courtroom of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a unique legal code was painstakingly compiled, a document that would become known as the Assize of Jerusalem. This was not merely a list of rules, it was a sophisticated blueprint for governing a complex, multicultural society under immense pressure. Its true historical impact, however, was revealed not in the kingdom that created it, but in the way it was eagerly adopted and adapted by the minor Crusader states of Cyprus and Antioch. For these smaller, often precarious realms, the Assize provided something they desperately lacked: a ready-made framework for stable, legitimate, and predictable governance that could reduce internal strife and project an image of enduring authority to both their subjects and their enemies. The origins of the Assize of Jerusalem are shrouded in some myth, but its practical beginnings are a fascinating story of legal pragmatism. Traditionally, it was said to have been established by the first king, Godfrey of Bouillon, but modern legal historians like John Lamonti argue it was more likely a gradual compilation, a living document that evolved over the 12th century through a combination of imported European feudal customs, the residual Roman law of the Byzantine Empire, and the practical necessities of ruling a population that was majority Armenian, Syriac, and Muslim. Its genius lay in this very hybridity. It didn't try to impose a purely Frankish system on an unwilling populace. Instead, it created separate courts for different communities, the Cour des Bourgeois for non-nobles of all faiths, and even specific courts for Syrian Christians and Muslims to handle their own affairs according to their traditions, all under the overarching authority of the High Court of the Nobles. This wasn't modern multiculturalism, but it was a brilliantly pragmatic system of rough tolerance that acknowledged reality and prioritized stability over pure cultural dominance. When the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself began to crumble after the disaster at Hattin in 1187, its greatest export became its legal system. The minor states that survived, particularly the Kingdom of Cyprus under the Lusignan dynasty and the rump state of Antioch, faced a governance crisis. They were filled with refugees riven by competing claims among the nobility and desperately needed to establish their legitimacy and administrative control. The Assize of Jerusalem provided an off-the-shelf solution, a pre-tested package of laws that commanded respect across the Latin East. King Aimery of Cyprus, a former baron of Jerusalem, formally adopted the Assize in the late 12th century, and it became the bedrock of Cypriot law for centuries. Similarly, the princes of Antioch integrated its principles to help stabilize their fractured realm. This was not a slavish copy-paste job. Each kingdom adapted it to their local circumstances, but the core framework provided a crucial continuity that made them appear not as ad hoc warlord states, but as legitimate, law-governed successors to the Jerusalemite ideal. The specific provisions within the Assize that made it so valuable were remarkably forward-thinking, particularly in the realm of commercial law. One of its most impactful innovations was the clear, standardized enforcement of contracts. In a region where trade was the lifeblood, the Assize provided a reliable legal mechanism for merchants, whether Italian, Greek, or Armenian, to resolve disputes over shipments, payments, and partnerships. This predictability encouraged commerce and attracted foreign investment, filling the coffers of these minor kingdoms. Another key area was inheritance law. The Assize contained detailed, unambiguous rules for the succession of fiefs and properties. This dramatically reduced the violent, destabilizing succession crises that plagued medieval realms. When a lord died, there was a clear legal path to determine his heir, preventing the kind of internal wars that could tear a small state apart from within. Furthermore, the assize meticulously defined the military obligations of vassals, specifying exactly how many knights a baron owed the king based on the size of his land grant. This created transparency and fairness, ensuring the kingdom's defense was organized and predictable, not subject to the whims of resentful nobles. The impact of this legal standardization, as legal historian Peter Edbury has detailed, was profound. It created a remarkable degree of administrative stability across the different Crusader states. A knight from Antioch who found refuge in Cyprus would find a familiar legal system waiting for him, his rights and obligations clearly understood. This fostered a sense of shared identity and common purpose among the Latin elite, even as their political fortunes declined. For the local populations, while they remained subjects, the consistent and predictable application of law, especially in commercial matters, provided a level of economic security that made Frankish rule more palatable and sustainable. The assize became the invisible architecture that held the Crusader world together long after its military power had faded, proving that a well-crafted law could be a more durable fortification than any castle. It demonstrated that the most powerful export from a kingdom could be the idea of justice, order, and legitimate governance, an institutional innovation from a minor realm that gave the entire Crusader experiment a coherence and resilience that far outlasted its founders. And so, as we reach the end of our journey through these 25 unsung turning points, a powerful new picture of the Crusades begins to emerge from the shadows. It is a picture not defined by the solitary brilliance of a Richard the Lionheart or a Saladin, but rather a vast, intricate mosaic crafted by countless smaller hands. We have seen how the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia provided the lifeline that saved the First Crusade, how the county of Tripoli's naval mastery broke the Siege of Acre, and how the kingdom of Cyprus used both diplomacy and grain to hold the entire effort together. We've witnessed the Principality of Antioch mastering intelligence gathering, the county of Edessa pioneering cultural fusion, and the Lordship of Sidon perfecting the art of logistics. From the financial ingenuity of the Templars propping up Armenia to the legal brilliance of the assizes bringing order to Cyprus, the lesson is undeniable. History, in its grandest moments, is not made by giants alone. It is redirected, reshaped, and given its lasting form by the countless minor actors operating in the spaces between empires, whose alliances, innovations, and sheer pragmatic will to survive ultimately dictated the flow of events. This broader lesson challenges us to reconsider not just the Crusades, but our entire understanding of the past. We are taught to look for history's authors in the palaces and on the battlefields where the great powers clashed. But the real story, the richer and more human story, is so often written in the margins in the harbor offices of Ragusa, the interpreter's tent in Oultrejordain, the surgical ward of the Hospital of St. John, and the council chambers of the Commune of Acre. It is a story of adaptation over brute force, of cultural borrowing over isolation, and of administrative genius over sheer might. To overlook these narratives is to only ever hear one note of a vast and complex symphony. Revisiting them allows us to gain a breathtakingly fuller understanding, revealing the interconnectedness of all things, how a decision in a Hungarian forest could drain resources from Jerusalem, or how an earthquake in Antioch could forge alliances that would last for a generation. It brings to mind the poignant observation by the historian Jonathan Riley Smith, who reminded us that the Crusades were not just an expedition but a process, a continuous evolution shaped by the environment and the people who inhabited it, both great and small. This process was driven as much by the merchant's contract and the engineer's blueprint as by the knight's vow, and so we turn to you. After journeying from Cilicia to Cyprus, from the deserts of Oultrejordain to the shipyards of Ragusa, which of these minor kingdoms do you find the most fascinating? Was it the cultural pragmatism of Edessa, the financial power of the Italian communes, or the unbreakable defiance of the Hospitallers at Margat? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love diving into these discussions with you. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history has sparked your curiosity, then you definitely won't want to miss what comes next. Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon, because we're just getting started unearthing the forgotten stories and overlooked figures that truly made our world. Our next adventure will take us to another riveting chapter of the past, forever searching for those single stones that redirected the great river of history. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep exploring. If this journey into the hidden corridors of Crusader history has ignited a spark of curiosity, you are far from alone, and the best part is that the exploration has only just begun. There are so many incredible ways to dive deeper into the worlds of Armenian Cilicia, the county of Tripoli, and the other fascinating realms we've discussed. For those who want to embark on their own historical adventures, let's talk about where to look next. A fantastic starting point is always a great book, and there are some truly engaging ones that bring these minor kingdoms to life. For a sweeping narrative that does an excellent job of integrating the stories of these smaller states into the broader Crusader saga, consider The Crusades, The Authoritative History by Thomas S. Bridge. If you're particularly fascinated by the cultural intersections and the practical realities of life in these frontier states, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by Amin Maalouf provides an indispensable and riveting perspective that will completely reshape your understanding of the period. Beyond the pages of books, the digital world offers unparalleled access to resources that would have been the envy of scholars just a generation ago. Many major universities and museums have digitized their special collections, putting high-resolution images of medieval manuscripts, maps, and charter documents right at your fingertips. Websites like the Internet Archive are a treasure trove for finding digitized versions of out-of-print historical works and primary source chronicles, like those of William of Tyre or Matthew of Edessa, which you can often read in translation. For a more structured online learning experience, platforms like Coursera and edX frequently offer free courses on medieval history from institutions like Yale and the University of London, which often dedicate entire modules to the politics and culture of the Crusader states. And don't underestimate the power of social media for connecting with a community of enthusiasts. Platforms like Twitter, now known as X, are home to a vibrant network of professional historians, independent researchers, and dedicated hobbyists. Following hashtags like medieval Twitter or Crusades history can lead you to fascinating threads, recently published academic articles, and lively debates that make the distant past feel immediately relevant. Of course, there is absolutely no substitute for standing in the very places where this history unfolded. If you ever have the opportunity to travel, the Eastern Mediterranean is an open-air museum waiting to be explored. In modern-day Turkey, you can journey into the Taurus Mountains to see the formidable castles of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, like the stunning dual fortresses of Yelankale and Toprakale, which once guarded strategic mountain passes. The island of Cyprus is dotted with incredible Gothic cathedrals and Lusignan palaces in cities like Nicosia and Famagusta, physical testaments to the wealthy and powerful kingdom it became. And while travel in the Levant requires careful planning, countries like Lebanon and Jordan are home to some of the most awe-inspiring Crusader sites in the world. You can walk the hauntingly beautiful halls of Krak Chevaliers in Syria, just over the Lebanese border, or stand in the immense vaulted chambers of Karak Castle in Jordan, feeling the sheer scale of the engineering and imagining the lords of Oultrejordain looking out from its walls over the very desert routes they controlled. To walk these stones is to breathe the same air as those who made the decisions that shaped centuries, connecting you to their story in a way that no book or screen ever could. This is your invitation to become not just a viewer of history, but an active participant in its